Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone isn't the grief, it's the shame of what you become just to survive. Every widow on the frontier knew this truth, but Sarah McKenna lived it every single day. In the mountains of 1870s Colorado, she spent her days fishing cold streams to feed her children. The work left her smelling of fish and river mud. The townspeople whispered and turned away when she passed. Even the shopkeepers barely tolerated her long enough to trade. Then one evening, she met the mountain man everyone feared. He was a giant with wild hair who lived alone in the peaks. Ashamed, she told him about her smell. He smiled and said something that changed everything. What happens when two broken people find that real love doesn't care what you smell like? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah McKenna hadn't always smelled of fish and desperation. 3 years ago, she'd worn lavender water behind her ears and spent Sunday afternoons reading poetry to her husband Thomas while he whittled by their cabin's stone hearth. Her hands had been soft then, unmarked by fishing hooks and river stones. Her children had known the comfort of a full pantry and a mother who sang while she cooked. Now, as she stood knee-deep in the icy waters of Bear Creek, her calloused fingers worked the patched fishing line with practiced efficiency. The morning mist clung to the mountain peaks surrounding their valley, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled above the pine trees. This was her 4th hour in the water, and she'd caught 6 trout, enough to trade for flour and beans in town if she was lucky. Her wedding ring, now loose on her thin finger, caught the early sunlight as she cast her line again. Thomas had placed that gold band on her finger 8 years ago, promising her a life of comfort and security. He'd kept that promise until consumption took him during the harsh winter of 1873, leaving Sarah with 2 children and debts she hadn't known existed. 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Ben waited on the creek bank, their patched clothes and 2 thin faces a constant reminder of how far they'd all fallen. Emma held baby Mary, who at 2 years old had never known her father's voice. The children understood the routine now. Stay quiet while Mama fished, help carry the catch back to the cabin, and never complain about the fish smell that clung to everything they owned. "Mama, there's a man watching us," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart lurching. In the 3 years since Thomas's death, she'd learned to fear unexpected visitors. Predators, mostly, or men who thought a widow might be desperate enough to accept unwanted advances in exchange for help she couldn't afford to refuse. But this figure stood different from the others, massive and still as the mountain itself. He watched from the tree line 50 yards upstream. Even at this distance, she could see he was larger than any man she'd ever encountered. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his beard covered most of his face. The townspeople called him the Bear Man, though she'd never heard his real name. They said he lived in a cave high in the peaks, that he'd killed men with his bare hands, that he came down to the valley only when the mood struck him. Sarah had seen him twice before, always from a distance. Once at the general store, where conversation stopped mid-sentence when he entered. Another time crossing the main street, where even the horses seemed to sense something wild about him. Both times, she'd felt that strange combination of fear and curiosity that made her want to look closer, while every instinct told her to look away. "Stay behind me," she murmured to Emma. Though she made no move to leave the water, they needed these fish. Whatever the mountain man wanted, she hoped he'd take it and go. Minutes passed. The man neither approached nor departed. He simply stood there, as patient as stone, watching her work. Sarah found herself growing annoyed despite her fear. Did he think this was entertainment? Did he enjoy seeing how the local widow scraped? Finally, she could stand it no longer. "If you're going to watch, you might as well make yourself useful," she called out, her voice carrying more boldness than she felt. To her surprise, he laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Then he began walking toward them. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd imagined. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His clothes were rough-hewn but well-made, buckskin pants and a wool shirt that had seen better days but showed careful mending. His hands, she noticed, were enormous but moved with surprising gentleness as he gestured. "You're fishing the wrong part of the creek," he said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "Current's too strong here. Fish can't rest." Sarah blinked. Of all the things she'd imagined he might say, fishing advice hadn't been among them. "I fish where I can reach the bottom," she replied, trying to keep the defensive edge from her voice. He nodded toward a bend in the creek about 30 yards downstream, where fallen logs created a natural pool. "Water's deeper there, but the current's gentle. Fish like to gather in the morning shadow." She looked where he pointed, then back at his face. His eyes were brown, she realized, and surprisingly kind. Not the eyes of a killer or a madman, just the eyes of a man who'd spent a lot of time alone. "I don't wade that deep," she admitted. "Current's too strong if I lose my footing." "I could show you," he offered, then seemed to realize how that sounded. His cheeks darkened beneath his beard. I could stand downstream. Case you slip." Emma's small hand found Sarah's skirt, gripping the wet fabric. The child had heard enough stories about the bear man to fill a dozen nightmares. But as Sarah looked at him, really looked, she saw something the townspeople had missed: loneliness. It was written in the careful way he held himself, in the hesitation before he spoke, in the hope that flickered briefly in his eyes before. He shuttered it away. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jonas," he replied. "Jonas Fletcher. I'm Sarah McKenna. These are my children." He nodded to each child in turn, his expression solemn and respectful. "Mom, Miss Emma, Master Ben." When his gaze fell on little Mary, his face softened completely. "And Miss Mary." The formal courtesy surprised her. Whatever Jonas Fletcher was, he'd been raised with manners. "Why do you want to help me?" Sarah asked. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains that surrounded them. "Been watching you fish for months," he said finally. "Takes courage what you're doing, raising children alone, keeping them fed." He looked back at her. "Figured maybe I could help." There was something in his tone, a recognition, perhaps, of what it meant to fight for survival, that made Sarah's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had acknowledged her struggle as courage rather than desperation? "The townspeople say you're dangerous," she said. "The townspeople say a lot of things." "Are you dangerous?" Jonas considered the question seriously. "I can be," he said, "but not to you, not to them." He gestured toward her children. Sarah found herself studying his face, looking for deception, and finding none. In 3 years of widowhood, she'd learned to read men quickly. Jonas Fletcher wasn't lying to her. "All right," she said. "Show me this fishing spot of yours." The smile that crossed his face transformed him completely. For just a moment, the lonely mountain man disappeared, replaced by someone younger and more hopeful. "Yes, Mom." As they gathered the children and moved downstream, Sarah caught Emma staring up at Jonas with curious eyes rather than frightened ones. Children, she'd learned, were often better judges of character than adults. They hadn't yet learned to see monsters where none existed. The fishing spot Jonas had indicated was everything he'd promised. Within an hour, Sarah had caught more fish than she typically managed in half a day. Jonas stood patient guard downstream, ready to help if the current proved too strong. But she found her footing more secure than expected. "You know these waters well," she said during a lull. "Grew up on a creek much like this one," Jonas replied. "Back in Missouri." "What brought you to Colorado?" His expression darkened slightly. "War," he said simply. Sarah nodded. She'd learned not to press men about their war experiences. Thomas had served briefly and returned changed, though he'd been luckier than most. Some men carried wounds that never healed. "Do you have family?" she asked instead. "Not anymore." The simple words carried a weight of loss that Sarah recognized. They stood in comfortable silence after that, two people who understood what it meant to have everything taken away. When the afternoon sun began to slant low through the canyon, Sarah finally waded to shore. Her string held 12 fat trout, more than enough to trade for a week's worth of supplies. Jonas had been right about the fishing spot, and she felt foolish for her earlier suspicion. "Thank you," she said as she gathered her things. "This will make a real difference." Jonas nodded, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something wrapped in soft leather. "For the children," he said, offering it to Emma. Emma looked to her mother for permission before unwrapping the gift. Inside was a small wooden fish, carved with intricate scales and painted with careful detail. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the work of someone with both skill and patience. "It's wonderful," Sarah breathed, turning the carving over in her hands. "You made this?" Jonas's cheeks colored again. "Gives me something to do in the evenings." Emma reached for the wooden fish, her eyes wide with delight. "It's beautiful, Mr. Fletcher." "Thank you." "You're very welcome, Miss Emma." As they prepared to part ways, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. The afternoon had been the most pleasant she'd experienced in months, not just because of the successful fishing, but because of the company. Jonas Fletcher might look like the wild man of the mountains, but he'd treated her and her children with a kindness she'd almost forgotten existed. "Will you be at the creek tomorrow?" she asked. Something hopeful flickered in his eyes. "If you'd like me to be." "I would," Sarah said, surprised by her own boldness. The children would too. As they walked back toward her cabin, Emma chattering excitedly about the wooden fish, Sarah realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time since Thomas's death, she'd felt like something more than a desperate widow scraping for survival. She'd felt like a woman worth helping, worth spending time with. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying. She'd grown accustomed to her loneliness, had even found a certain safety in it. But Jonas Fletcher's quiet kindness had cracked something open inside her that she'd thought was sealed forever. That evening, as she cleaned the fish and prepared their dinner, Sarah caught herself humming, something she hadn't done in 3 years. The children noticed too, glancing at each other with the pleased surprise of children who see their mother smile. Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat by the dying fire and examined the wooden fish Jonas had carved. The detail was extraordinary, every scale perfectly rendered, the fins delicately shaped. This was the work of a man with infinite patience and careful hands. Not the hands of a killer or a madman. She thought about the way he'd spoken to her children, with respect and gentleness, the way he'd stood guard while she fished, never once making her feel watched or judged, the way his face had lit up when she'd agreed to meet him again tomorrow. Maybe, Sarah thought, as she prepared for bed, the townspeople were wrong about Jonas Fletcher. Maybe they saw only what they expected to see, a large, wild-looking man who lived alone in the mountains and missed the man beneath. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find out. 3 days later, Sarah found herself looking forward to her morning fishing with an anticipation that both pleased and worried her. Jonas had appeared at the creek each day as promised, helping her find the best spots and standing quiet guard while she worked. Their conversations had grown easier, ranging from practical matters, the best bait for mountain trout, how to read, the weather in the cloud formations, to more personal territory. She'd learned that he'd been a cavalry scout before the war ended, that he'd come west seeking solitude after losing his family to cholera, and that he possessed a gentle humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. He'd learned that she'd been a schoolteacher before marriage, that she missed reading more than almost anything else, and that her greatest fear was failing to provide for her children. This morning felt different somehow. The air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the aspens on the mountainsides had begun their slow turn toward gold. Sarah had woken before dawn, taking extra care with her appearance, braiding her hair more carefully, choosing her least patched dress. She told herself it was simple pride, but her heart knew better. Jonas was already waiting when she arrived at their usual spot, but instead of his customary place on the bank, he stood in the shallow water near a fallen log. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. In his hands, he held something that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a fishing net, not the rough, hastily woven thing she might have expected, but a work of art. The mesh was perfectly uniform, the edges bound with leather strips, the wooden frame smooth as silk. Even from a distance, she could see the hours of painstaking work it represented. "Good morning," Jonas said, his voice carrying a note of nervous anticipation. "Good morning." Sarah approached slowly, her children trailing behind her. Emma had taken to chattering excitedly about Mr. Jonas each morning, while Ben had overcome his initial shyness enough to wave when they arrived. Little Mary, perched on Emma's hip, had begun reaching toward Jonas whenever she saw him, a gesture that never failed to bring a smile to his weathered face. "I thought this might help," Jonas said, lifting the net slightly. "Make the work easier." Sarah stared at the beautiful craftsmanship, her throat tight with emotion. In her 3 years of widowhood, no one had given her anything that would make her life easier. The townspeople offered charity grudgingly, day-old bread, hand-me-down, clothes for the children, but always with the air of people doing their Christian duty rather than genuine kindness. This was different. This was a gift born of observation and care, designed specifically to help her succeed rather than merely survive. "Jonas," she breathed, reaching out to touch the smooth wood of the frame. "This is beautiful. You made this." His cheeks darkened beneath his beard. "Figured you could use both hands to guide it instead of holding that line all day. Net'll catch more fish, faster." "How long did this take you?" "A week or so. Evenings mostly. A week of evenings." Sarah's chest tightened as she imagined him working. By firelight in whatever shelter he called home, his large hands carefully weaving each strand, thinking of her struggle and wanting to ease it. "I can't accept this," she said. Though every fiber of her being wanted to reach for the net, Jonas's face fell. "It's not proper? It's too much, too valuable." She gestured helplessly. "I have nothing to give you in return." "Don't want anything in return, but Sarah." The way he said her name stopped her protests. It was the first time he'd used it, and the sound sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "You spend 4-5 hours a day in that water. Your lips turn blue, your hands shake from cold. This net might get you the same catch in half the time." He was right, and they both knew it. With the net, she could work more efficiently, spend less time in the frigid water, perhaps even catch enough to improve their circumstances beyond mere survival. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do you want to help me?" Jonas was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the mountains and back again. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. 3 years I've been living up in those peaks," he said. 3 years telling myself I was better off alone, that I didn't need anybody, didn't want the complications that come with caring about people. He paused, shifting the net in his hands. "Then I started watching you down here, day after day, never giving up, never asking for help you knew wouldn't come. Fighting for those babies like a mountain cat fights for her cubs." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected praise. "Made me remember what it felt like to admire somebody," Jonas continued. "To want to be part of something again, even if it's just standing guard while you fish." The honesty in his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was a man who understood loneliness as deeply as she did, who'd chosen isolation the way she'd been forced into it, and somehow, watching her struggle, had called him back toward human connection. "I smell like fish," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Every day, all day. The children are used to it, but the townspeople, they wrinkle their noses when I pass. Even the shopkeepers can barely tolerate me long enough to make their trades." Jonas stared at her for a moment, then threw back his head and laughed, not mockingly but with genuine delight. "You smell like fish because you work hard to feed your family. That's nothing to be ashamed of. But the smell... I love fish, Jonas said simply, his eyes twinkling with humor. Always have. Used to drive my mother to distraction when I was a boy, coming home covered in creek mud and fish scales. She'd make me wash off with lye soap before I could come to the table. The casual mention of his mother, the first time he'd spoken of his family with anything approaching warmth, made Sarah's heart skip. But it was his matter-of-fact acceptance of something she'd been ashamed of for 3 years that truly undid. Her. You love fish, she repeated, hardly daring to believe it. Love catching them, love cleaning them, love the way they taste when they're fresh from the water. Jonas stepped closer, his expression growing serious. But mostly, I love that you're strong enough to do whatever it takes to provide for your children. That kind of strength is beautiful, Sarah. The smell that comes with it is just proof of how hard you're willing to work. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks before she could stop them. 3 years of shame, 3 years of holding her head high, while inside she cringed at her own scent. 3 years of feeling like she'd fallen so far from respectability that she'd never climb back up. And here was a man telling her that her sacrifice was beautiful. "Oh," she whispered, pressing her hands to her face. "Sarah." Jonas's voice was immediately concerned. "Did I say something wrong?" She shook her head, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Behind her she heard Emma's worried voice. "Mama, are you hurt?" "Your mama's fine," Jonas said gently, though his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy, Miss Emma." Happy? Was that what this feeling was? This overwhelming relief, this sense of a burden she'd carried alone, suddenly becoming lighter. Sarah hadn't been truly happy in so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Gradually, she regained her composure, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't usually..." "Nothing to apologize for." Sarah looked at the net again, seeing not just the beautiful craftsmanship, but the kindness behind it. The evenings Jonas had spent thinking of her, working to make her life easier, the simple acceptance of something she'd been ashamed of for years. "Thank you," she said, reaching for the net. "I'll treasure it." Jonas's smile was radiant. "Let's see how it works." The net was everything he'd promised and more. Within 2 hours, Sarah had caught twice her usual number of fish with half the effort. The ingenious design allowed her to work in shallower water, while still reaching the deeper pools where the fish gathered. Her hands stayed warmer, her back ached less, and for the first time in 3 years, fishing felt less like desperate labor and more like skilled work. But it was the company that truly transformed the morning. Jonas had positioned himself upstream, pointing out likely spots and offering quiet encouragement. When Ben grew restless, Jonas produced a small carved whistle from his pocket and showed the boy how to make different sounds. When Mary fussed, he sang a soft song that made her giggle and clap her hands. Most remarkably, he'd brought a book, a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. And when Emma expressed curiosity, he'd read to her in a clear, educated voice that revealed yet another layer to his character. "You read beautifully," Sarah said during a break, settling beside him on a fallen log while the children played at the water's edge. "Had a good teacher once," Jonas replied. "Army chaplain who figured education was as important as military training." "I was a teacher before I married," Sarah said. "I miss it terribly." "What did you teach?" "Everything in a one-room schoolhouse back in Missouri. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history." She smiled at the memory. "Poetry, when I could get away with it." "You could teach again," Jonas said quietly, "when the children are older." The suggestion was so far from her current reality that Sarah almost laughed. "I'm a widow who smells like fish, Jonas, who would hire me to teach their children. Someone who values character over appearance," he replied firmly. "Someone who recognizes that you've got more real-world education than most folks with fancy degrees." His faith in her was both touching and painful. Sarah had buried her dreams along with her husband, convinced that survival was the only goal she could afford. But sitting here beside Jonas, watching her children play peacefully while her morning's catch swam in the basket, more fish than she'd ever caught before. She felt the faintest stirring of hope for something beyond mere existence. "Jonas," she said suddenly, "where do you live? I mean your actual home." He gestured toward the peaks. "Got a cabin about 5 miles up the mountain. Built it myself after I came to Colorado." "Is it very isolated? Haven't seen another soul." "In 3 years, except when I come down to town for supplies." He paused. "Until I started watching you fish." The loneliness in his admission made Sarah's heart ache. "Don't you get lonely?" "Every day," Jonas said simply. But lonely felt safer than caring about someone and losing them again. The pain in his voice told her there was a story there. Loss that went deeper than he'd yet revealed. But Sarah understood the impulse to choose isolation over the risk of further heartbreak. She'd been living the same way, protecting herself and her children by keeping everyone at arm's length. "And now?" she asked. Jonas looked at her, his brown eyes serious. "Now I think maybe the risk is worth it." The words hung between them, heavy, with implication. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the moment for what it was, a turning point where friendship might become something deeper, where two lonely people might choose connection over safety. "The risk of what?" she whispered. "Caring about you," Jonas said. "About Emma and Ben and little Mary. About whether you have enough to eat, whether you're warm at night, whether you're happy." Sarah's breath caught. In 3 years, no one had cared whether she was happy. Survival had been the only consideration for herself and everyone around her. "I care about you too," she admitted, the words barely audible over the sound of rushing water. Jonas's face transformed, hope and joy replacing the careful guardedness she'd grown accustomed to. "Do you?" "Yes," Sarah said, more firmly this time. "I look forward to seeing you every morning. I think about our conversations while I work. She hesitated, then forged ahead. "I haven't felt this way about anyone since Thomas died." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children play, both aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Finally, Jonas spoke. "Sarah, would it be appropriate if I—" He stopped, frustration crossing his features. "I'm not good with words when it matters." "Try," Sarah encouraged gently. "Would you consider letting me court you properly?" Jonas asked in a rush. "I know I'm not much to look at and I don't have fine clothes or social standing, but I could provide for you and the children. I could make you happy, or at least I'd try my best to." Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding. A proposal of courtship. From a man who'd shown her more kindness in a week than she'd received in 3 years. A man who accepted her as she was, who saw strength in her struggle rather than shame. "The townspeople won't approve," she said quietly. "Do you care what they think?" Sarah considered the question seriously. The townspeople who'd whispered about her, who'd made her feel ashamed of doing whatever it took to feed her children, who'd offered charity grudgingly when they offered it at all. Did she care about their approval? No, she realized with surprise. "I don't think I do." Jonas's smile was brilliant. "Then will you consider it?" Sarah looked at her children, playing happily, while the man who'd shown them such kindness watched over them. She thought about the net he'd crafted with his own hands, the books he'd brought to read to Emma, the gentle way he'd sung to Mary. She thought about his quiet strength, his understanding of loss, his willingness to risk his heart again. "Yes," she said, "I'll consider it." The joy that crossed Jonas's face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah McKenna felt truly seen, truly valued, truly hopeful about the future. As they gathered their things to head home, the net full of fish and the children chattering excitedly about Mr. Jonas's whistle, Sarah realized that her shame had begun to transform into something else entirely. Pride, perhaps, or simply the recognition that love, Real love didn't care what you smelled like. It only cared that you were brave enough to keep going, day after day, no matter how hard the water was or how cold the morning might be. And in that moment, Sarah McKenna felt braver than she had in years. The leather fishing pouch appeared 2 weeks later, weathered and worn, but still beautiful in its craftsmanship. Jonas presented it to Sarah with the same shy hesitation he'd shown with the net, his large hands gentle as he explained its history. "Belonged to my father," he said, settling beside her on their usual log while the children played in the shallow water. "He was a fisherman back in Missouri before he took up farming. Made this pouch himself when I was about Ben's age." Sarah accepted the pouch with reverent hands, feeling the smoothness of leather that had been touched by countless hands over the years. Inside, she found an assortment of hand-tied flies, carved bone hooks, and lead weights. A fisherman's treasure. Trove accumulated over decades. "Jonas, I can't," she began, but he stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "He'd want it used," Jonas said simply. "Always said the worst thing that could happen to fishing gear was sitting idle." The gift represented more than practicality. It was Jonas sharing a piece of his family history, trusting her with something precious from his past. Sarah understood the magnitude of the gesture. In the 2 weeks since their conversation about courtship, they'd grown closer, but this felt like crossing another threshold entirely. "Tell me about him," she said, settling the pouch carefully in her lap. Jonas's expression grew distant, but not with the shuttered pain she'd come to associate with mentions of his family. Instead, there was warmth there, the soft glow of cherished memories. "Big man, like me," Jonas said, "but gentle, never raised his voice, never raised his hand. Used to take me fishing every Sunday after church, said it was important for a man to know how to provide for himself." "He sounds wonderful." He was. Jonas picked up a smooth riverstone, turning it over in his hands. "When the war started, he didn't want me to enlist. Said I had better things to do than kill other folks' sons, but I was 18 and full of righteous anger about preserving the Union." Sarah heard the regret in his voice and reached out instinctively, covering his free hand with hers. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm, but more than that, it felt natural, the kind of comfort. One person offered another without thinking. "You couldn't have known what it would cost," she said softly. Jonas looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "After I enlisted, Pa wrote me letters every week. Told me about the farm, about Ma's garden, about which neighbors had babies and which ones got married. Normal life, you know, the kind I was supposedly fighting to preserve. What happened to them? Cholera outbreak, summer of '64, swept through 3 counties in Missouri. By the time I got word and made it home on leave, they were already buried." Jonas's voice remained steady, but Sarah felt the tension in his hand. "Came home to an empty farmhouse and graves I'd never seen." Sarah's heart clenched with sympathy. She'd lost Thomas slowly, had time to prepare and say goodbye. Jonas had lost his entire family while he was hundreds of miles away, fighting someone else's war. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "sold the farm to pay for their funeral, and came west. As soon as my enlistment ended, figured I'd had enough of caring about people, enough of putting down roots. Easier to live alone in the mountains where nobody could die on me. But that's not really living," Sarah said gently. "That's just surviving." Jonas met her eyes, and she saw recognition there, the acknowledgement of someone who understood the difference between existing and truly being alive. "No," he agreed. "It's not. Took me 3 years to figure that out. What changed your mind?" Jonas's smile was soft, transforming his weathered features. "Started watching a brave woman fight for her children every morning. Made me remember what it felt like to admire somebody's strength instead of just avoiding their potential loss." The compliment warmed Sarah more than the morning sun. In the weeks since Jonas had begun courting her, if their daily fishing meetings could be called courtship, she'd begun to see herself through his eyes, not as a desperate widow scraping by, but as a woman of strength and determination, I wasn't always strong, she admitted. When Thomas first died, I spent 2 weeks in bed crying. Emma had to take care of Ben and the baby while I fell apart. That's not weakness, Jonas said firmly. That's grief. There's a difference. The town minister said I needed to trust in God's plan and get on with my duties. Jonas's expression darkened. The town minister never lost a spouse and had to figure out how to feed 3 children with no income. His protective anger on her behalf was both startling and oddly comforting. Sarah had grown so accustomed to criticism from the minister, from former friends, from shopkeepers who thought she should be more grateful for their grudging charity, that having someone defend her choices felt revolutionary. You don't think I was selfish for grieving when the children needed me? I think you were human, Jonas said. And I think Emma learned more about real strength from watching you pull yourself together and fight for your family than she ever would have from watching you pretend everything was fine. Sarah had never considered her breakdown from that perspective. At the time, it had felt like the ultimate failure, a mother abandoning her children when they needed her most. But Jonas was right. Emma had seen her mother face the worst possible loss and eventually find the courage to keep going. Emma does seem remarkably capable for her age, Sarah mused, because she learned from watching you that women can be strong and still feel deeply. That's a valuable lesson. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Ben attempt to catch minnows with his hands while Emma kept careful watch over Mary. The children had adapted to Jonas's presence with remarkable ease, accepting him as a natural part of their morning routine. "What about your war service?" Sarah asked eventually. "You mentioned being a cavalry scout." Jonas's expression grew more guarded, but he didn't shut down the way she'd expected. "Spent most of the war in Tennessee and Georgia. Sherman's march. To the sea, then up through the Carolinas. That must have been difficult. War's always difficult, but scouting was better than infantry. Mostly I rode ahead of the main force, mapped terrain, identified Confederate positions. Important work, but I wasn't in the thick of the fighting as much as some." Sarah sensed there was more to the story. There always was with men who'd served in that terrible conflict, but she didn't press. Jonas would share what he was comfortable sharing when he was ready. "Is that where you learned to read the land so well? You always seem to know where the fish will be." Jonas nodded. "Good scout learns to read everything. Weather, water, animal. Tracks, the way vegetation grows in different areas. Saved my life more than once, knowing how to interpret what I saw. And after the war, drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives, did some trapping, built fences for farmers who needed the help. Nothing that tied me down anywhere." He gestured toward the mountains. "Then I found this valley and decided it was far enough from everything that mattered. Until now." Jonas turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious. "Until now." The weight of his words settled between them. Sarah felt herself balanced on the edge of something momentous, a choice between the safety of her carefully constructed solitude and the terrifying possibility of opening her heart again. "Jonas," she said quietly, "what are we doing here? Really, I was hoping," Jonas said carefully, "that we were 2 people getting to know each other. 2 people who might discover they could make each other happy. And if the townspeople object, they already whisper about me fishing alone with you. Let them whisper. Are you happy when you're with me?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Was she happy? For 3 years, happiness had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. But these mornings with Jonas, learning to use the net he'd made, sharing stories, watching him interact with her children, had brought something back to life inside her that she'd thought was permanently extinguished. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." "Then that's what matters." As if summoned by their conversation, Ben came splashing over to them, his pants soaked to the knees and his face bright with excitement. "Mr. Jonas, I saw a fish this big." Ben held his hands apart to indicate a fish of improbable size. "Did you now?" Jonas said seriously. "What kind of fish was it?" "I don't know. It was silver and had big eyes." "Sounds like a mountain whitefish," Jonas said. "They're clever fellows, good eating but tricky to catch." Could you teach me to catch one? Jonas glanced at Sarah, seeking permission. When she nodded, his face lit up. I'd be honored to, Master. Ben, but it'll take patience. Fish like that aren't caught in a hurry. I can be patient, Ben declared, with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old. As Jonas began explaining the basics of reading water for fish signs, Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Watching this large, gentle man take her son seriously, treating Ben's questions with the same respect he'd show an adult, she realized how much her children had been missing. Thomas had been a good father, but he died when Ben was barely 2, and Mary was just a baby. Neither of her younger children had memories of having a man in their lives who cared about their interests, who took time to teach them things, who made them feel important. Emma, who did remember Thomas, had grown quiet during Jonas's explanation. Sarah watched her daughter's face, trying to read her expression. Was she remembering her father, feeling disloyal for enjoying Jonas's attention? Emma, Sarah called softly, come sit with me. Her eldest daughter approached slowly, settling beside Sarah on the log. Mama, is Mr. Jonas going to be our new papa? The direct question caught Sarah off guard. She'd been so focused on her own feelings, her own fears and hopes, that she hadn't fully considered how the children might be processing Jonas's regular presence in their lives. Would that frighten you? Sarah asked carefully. Emma was quiet. For a long moment, watching Jonas patiently guide Ben's small hands as they practiced casting motions. I miss Papa, she said finally. I miss him too, sweetheart, but Mr. Jonas is kind, and he makes you smile again. The observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd watched her mother carefully for 3 years. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's insight. He does make me smile, Sarah admitted, and he brought books. Papa used to read to us. The mention of Thomas reading to the children, a memory Sarah treasured, should have brought guilt or the sense that she was betraying her late husband's memory. Instead, she felt something like peace. Thomas had loved his children desperately. If he could see them now, wouldn't he want them to have someone who would read to them again? Yes, he did, Sarah said softly. I think Papa would like Mr. Jonas, Emma announced with startling certainty. The comment took Sarah's breath away. Her 8-year-old daughter, with the unconscious wisdom of childhood, had identified something Sarah hadn't dared articulate even to herself. Thomas, who had valued kindness above all else, who had chosen Sarah precisely because she was strong enough to be his partner rather than simply his dependent, would indeed have liked Jonas Fletcher. I think you're right, Sarah whispered. That evening, as they prepared to part ways, Jonas helped Sarah secure the day's catch in her basket, another impressive haul thanks to his father's fishing gear and his patient instruction. Sarah, he said quietly, glancing toward the children who were gathering their things, I know this is complicated. Courting a widow with children, dealing with town gossip, the differences in our circumstances. Jonas. Let me finish, he said gently. I know it's complicated, but I want you to know that when I think about my future, really think about it, I see you in it. You and Emma and Ben and little Mary, I see helping them grow up, teaching Ben to fish, properly reading with Emma, watching Mary take her first steps without fear that she'll fall. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. You've given this serious thought. Every day for 2 weeks, Jonas admitted, and every day the picture gets clearer. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm just asking you to know that this isn't casual for me. You're not a diversion or a convenience. He paused, searching for words. What am I? Sarah whispered. You're the first person in 3 years who made me want to come down from the mountain, Jonas said simply. Your hope. As they walked back toward town, Sarah's mind churned with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Jonas Fletcher was offering her something she'd never dared dream of again. Not just security or convenience, but genuine partnership. A man who saw her strength rather than her struggles, who valued her children rather than viewing them as burdens, who understood loss deeply enough to recognize the courage it took to risk caring again. But accepting his courtship would mean more than personal happiness. It would mean defying the town's expectations, risking the fragile social position she'd managed to maintain, potentially making life harder for her children if the community turned against them. That night, as she tucked Emma into bed, her daughter asked quietly, "Mama, are you going to marry Mr. Jonas?" "I don't know, sweetheart. How would you feel if I did?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I think I'd feel safe," she said finally, "the way I used to feel when Papa was here. Safety." It was such a simple word, but it encompassed everything Sarah had been struggling to provide for 3 years. Physical safety, emotional safety, the security of knowing someone else cared about their well-being. As Sarah lay in her own bed that night, Thomas's wedding ring still on her finger, she found herself imagining a different kind of future. Not the grim endurance she'd planned for, but something warmer. A home where children laughed freely, where a woman could feel beautiful despite calloused hands and the lingering scent of river water. Where love grew not from desperation, but from mutual respect and genuine affection. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah McKenna fell asleep thinking about hope instead of mere survival, and in her dreams she smelled like fish, and someone loved her for it. The morning Ben first called Jonas Papa was the morning everything changed. It happened so naturally that Sarah almost missed it. Ben running to show Jonas a particularly interesting rock, calling out, "Papa, look!" before stopping short, his small face flushing with embarrassment. Jonas knelt to Ben's level, accepting the rock with the same serious attention he always gave the boy's discoveries. "That's a fine specimen, Ben," he said quietly. "See these streaks of quartz? They catch the light just like the scales on a trout." Sarah watched her son's shoulders relax as Jonas treated the slip as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No correction, no awkwardness, just gentle acceptance that spoke volumes about the man's character. Later, as they prepared to head home, Jonas produced something from his coat pocket, a small wooden horse carved with the same intricate detail as Emma's fish. This one was clearly meant for Ben, with a flowing mane and powerful legs captured mid-gallop. "For me?" Ben breathed, reaching for the carving with reverent hands. "Thought you might like it," Jonas said. "Carved it from pine wood I found up the mountain. See how the grain runs with the horse's back? Makes him look like he's really moving." Ben clutched the horse to his chest, his eyes shining. "It's the most beautiful thing I ever saw." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. In the month since Jonas had begun courting her, though they'd never formally defined their relationship, he'd shown more thoughtful attention to her children than anyone except herself. Each gift was carefully chosen, personally crafted, designed, to bring joy rather than simply meet a need. "What do you say, Ben?" Sarah prompted gently. "Thank you, Papa Jonas," Ben exclaimed, then stopped, clapping his free hand over his mouth as he realized what he'd said. The silence stretched for a heartbeat before Jonas spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "You're very welcome, son." The word son hung in the morning air like a benediction. Sarah saw tears gathering in Jonas's eyes, and her own vision blurred as she realized what this moment meant. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Family. Emma, who'd been watching the exchange with unusual intensity, stepped forward. "Papa Jonas," she said deliberately, testing the words, "will you read to us today?" Jonas's smile was radiant. "I'd be honored to, Emma." As they settled in their usual spot by the creek, Jonas, with his battered copy of Shakespeare and the children arranged around him like eager disciples, Sarah felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of their situation. This wasn't courtship anymore, not in any traditional sense. This was a family forming itself through daily choice and quiet devotion. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. For weeks, she'd been thinking of Jonas as a potential husband, weighing the practical and emotional benefits of remarriage. But watching him read to her children with the patience of a natural father, seeing the way they'd already claimed him as their own, she understood that the decision had been made gradually, without her conscious participation. They belonged together. The question was whether she had the courage to make it official. "Mama!" Mary babbled from Sarah's lap, reaching toward Jonas with chubby arms. At 2 years old, Mary had no memories of Thomas, no conflicted feelings about accepting a new father figure. To her, Jonas was simply the kind man who sang songs and made her siblings happy. Jonas looked up from his reading, his face softening at Mary's gesture. "May I?" he asked Sarah. Sarah nodded, transferring the toddler to Jonas's waiting arms. Mary settled against his broad chest with complete trust, her tiny fingers playing with the buttons on his shirt while he continued reading. The sight of this large, gentle man holding her youngest child with such natural tenderness nearly undid Sarah's composure. Thomas had been a wonderful father, but he died when Mary was just months old. She'd never known the security of a father's protection, the comfort of being held by someone strong enough to keep all dangers at bay. Now, watching Mary curl contentedly in Jonas's arms while he read about love conquering all obstacles, Sarah felt something like destiny settling around them. This was right. Not perfect, not without complications, but fundamentally, essentially right. After the reading, while the children played and Sarah worked with her net, Jonas approached her with an unusual nervousness in his manner. "Sarah," he said, settling beside her on the log, "we need to talk about what just happened. You mean Ben calling you Papa?" "All of it. Ben, Emma, the way they've accepted me." Jonas ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the dark strands. "I need to know if this is what you want, because those children are getting attached, and if I'm reading this wrong—" "You're not reading it wrong," Sarah said softly. Jonas studied her face intently. "You're sure? Because once children start thinking of a man as their father, it becomes real for them in a way that's hard to undo." Sarah set down her net and turned to face him fully. "Jonas, can I ask you something? Anything. When you look at Emma and Ben and Mary, what do you see?" Jonas glanced toward the children, his expression thoughtful. "I see bright, brave kids who've learned to take care of each other. I see Emma trying to be grown up before her time, and Ben hungry for someone to teach him about being a man. I see Mary who deserves to grow up feeling protected and loved." He paused, "And I see pieces of you in all of them, your strength, your kindness, your determination. And do you want to be their father, really and truly, not just because you care about me?" "Sarah," Jonas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I dream about it, teaching Ben to whittle and fish properly, helping Emma with her letters when she's ready for more advanced books, walking Mary to her first day of school someday." He met her eyes. "I want to be the man they run to when they're hurt or scared or excited about something they've discovered." The longing in his voice convinced Sarah more than any declaration of love could have. Jonas didn't just want her, he wanted her children genuinely and completely. He wanted the chaos and responsibility and joy that came with being a father. "Then stop asking my permission," Sarah said with a smile. "They've already chosen you." Before Jonas could respond, Ben came running over with his wooden horse, chattering excitedly about the adventures he'd been imagining. Emma followed more, slowly, but her face was bright with happiness as she listened to her brother's elaborate stories. "Papa Jonas," Ben said, unconsciously using the name again, "could you make a whole herd of horses? Then they could all run together." "That's a fine idea," Jonas said seriously, "but it would take quite a while to carve that many horses." "I could help," Ben offered eagerly. "I could learn to carve too." Jonas looked to Sarah for permission, and she nodded. "I'd be honored to teach you, Ben. Carving's good work for a man to know." As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself watching Jonas with new eyes. She'd been thinking of him as a potential husband, weighing his qualities against her needs and fears. But seeing him with her children, truly seeing him, not just Noticing, she realized he was already so much more than that. He was the man who remembered that Emma loved stories and brought books to read. The man who listened to Ben's endless questions with genuine interest and patience. The man who sang nonsense songs to Mary just to hear her laugh. He was the man who'd somehow, without either of them planning it, become essential to their daily happiness. "Jonas," she said during a quiet moment while the children were absorbed in their play, "there's something I need to tell you." His expression grew serious. "What is it?" "The townspeople have been talking about us, about you spending time with me and the children." "What kind of talking?" Sarah sighed. "The usual kind. That it's improper for a widow to be keeping company with a man without proper supervision, that you're taking advantage of my desperation, that I'm setting a poor example for other women in the community." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Do you believe any of that?" "No, but it's making things difficult. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street yesterday to avoid speaking to me. The minister's wife made pointed comments about moral standards when I was in the general store. Are they treating the children differently?" The question revealed exactly what Sarah loved most about Jonas. His first concern was always for her children's well-being. "Not yet," she said. "But if this continues, they might. Emma's at an age where she notices when people whisper about us." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains. "What do you want to do?" "I want to stop caring what they think," Sarah said honestly, "but I have to consider what's best for Emma and Ben and Mary. If the community turns against us completely, it could affect their future opportunities, their ability to make friends, their prospects for marriage someday. And if we were properly married, would that satisfy the gossips?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah felt her heart speed up as she realized they'd reached the moment she'd been both dreading and anticipating. "For weeks, are you asking me to marry you, Jonas Fletcher?" Jonas stood abruptly, beginning to pace back and forth in front of the log. "I'm asking if that's what you want," he said. "I'm asking if you could be happy as my wife, if you could see yourself building a life with me that goes beyond these morning fishing trips." "And what would that life look like?" Jonas stopped pacing and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. "It would look like a home where children feel safe and loved, where you never have to worry about having enough food or warm clothes for winter, where someone else shares the burden of providing and protecting and caring. And for you, what would you get from such a marriage?" "A family," Jonas said simply. "A reason to come down from the mountain every day, someone to share meals with, to talk over the day's events, to plan for the future." His thumb stroked gently over her knuckles. "Someone to love who might love me back." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Jonas, I already love you back." The admission surprised them both. Sarah hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even fully acknowledged it to herself until the words left her mouth. But sitting there with her hands in his, looking into eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness and acceptance, she realized it was absolutely true. "You do?" Jonas's voice was barely a whisper. "I do. I love the way you treat my children as if they were your own. I love your patience and your gentleness and your quiet strength. I love that you see beauty in things other people overlook, including me." Jonas raised her hands to his lips, pressing soft kisses to her knuckles. "Sarah McKenna," he said formally, "will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to Emma and Ben and Mary? Will you build a life with me that honors what we've both lost while celebrating what we've found together?" The proposal was everything Sarah hadn't dared dream of. Not just an offer of security or convenience, but a genuine partnership based on love and mutual respect. A chance to give her children the father they deserved, while accepting the love of a man who valued her exactly as she was. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes to all of it." Jonas's smile was brilliant as he stood and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was gentle but firm, full of promise and relief and the kind of joy that comes from finding exactly what you need in the last place you expected to look. "Mama!" Emma's voice interrupted them. "Are you crying again?" Sarah and Jonas separated, laughing as they realized they had an audience. All three children stood watching them, with expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. "Happy tears," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "The very best kind." "Does this mean Papa Jonas is really going to be our papa?" Ben asked hopefully. Jonas knelt. To the boy's level, his expression serious. "Would you like that, Ben?" "More than anything," Ben declared, throwing his arms around Jonas's neck. Emma approached more slowly, her 8-year-old mind clearly working through the implications. "Will we live with you in the mountains?" "We'll figure out the best place for all of us," Jonas said, including her in his gaze. "Somewhere with room for everyone to be happy. And we'll still fish together? Every day, if you want to." Emma nodded decisively. "Then I think it's a good idea." Mary, too young to understand the conversation, but smart enough to recognize celebration, clapped her hands and babbled happily. Jonas scooped her up, spinning her around until she squealed with delight, as Sarah watched her children embrace their new father, for that's what he was now. Regardless of any formal ceremony, she felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Not the absence of worry, but the presence of hope. The certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The gossips could whisper all they wanted. The townspeople could disapprove. Sarah McKenna was going to marry the man she loved, give her children the father they deserved, and build a life based on acceptance rather than shame. And if she smelled like fish while she did it, well, that was perfectly fine. After all, her husband-to-be loved fish. The trouble began 3 days after Jonas proposed, when Federal Marshal William Brennan rode into town asking questions about a deserter named Jonas Fletcher. Sarah first heard about it from Emma, who came running home from the general store with her eyes wide with worry and her small face pale with fear. "Mama," Emma whispered, glancing around their small cabin as if walls might have ears, "there's a man in town asking about Papa Jonas. Mrs. Patterson says he's a lawman." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What kind of questions?" "About where he lives, how long he's been here, if anyone's seen him recently." Emma's voice trembled. "Mama, they're saying Papa Jonas is in trouble with the law." Sarah sank into a chair, her mind racing. Jonas had mentioned his military service, but only in passing. She'd sensed there was more to the story, but she'd respected his privacy. Now she wondered if her trust had been misplaced. "Emma, I need you to watch Ben and Mary while I go into town," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Don't let anyone in, and don't tell anyone where I've gone." "Are you going to warn Papa Jonas?" The question revealed how much her eldest daughter had already claimed Jonas as family. Despite her own fear, Sarah felt a rush of love for Emma's loyalty. "I'm going to find out what's happening," Sarah said. "Then we'll decide what to do." The ride into town felt endless, though it was barely 2 miles. Sarah's mind churned with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if Jonas was a criminal? What if everything he'd told her about his past was a lie? What if she'd been preparing to marry a man who would bring danger to her children? But even as these fears tormented her, a deeper part of her soul rebelled against them. The Jonas she knew was gentle, honest, protective of those weaker than himself. Whatever trouble followed him from his past, she couldn't believe it came from genuine wrongdoing. The marshal was easy to spot, a tall, lean man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He stood outside the general store, questioning Mr. Henderson while a small crowd of townspeople gathered to listen. "Big fellow," Marshal Brennan was saying as Sarah approached. "Dark hair, beard, lives alone up in the mountains, goes by Jonas Fletcher, though that might not be his real name." "We know him," Mr. Henderson replied carefully. "Comes down for supplies sometimes, keeps to himself mostly." "When did you see him last?" Sarah's heart hammered as she realized the marshal was following a fresh trail. If Jonas had been in town, recently someone would remember. Few weeks back, maybe? Henderson's voice carried the reluctance of a man who didn't like involving himself in other people's troubles. "This man is wanted for desertion during wartime," Marshal Brennan announced. To the gathered crowd, anyone harboring him or providing him aid could face federal charges. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Desertion. In the aftermath of the Civil War, it was one of the most serious charges a man could face. Deserters were considered traitors, cowards who'd abandoned their duty when their country needed them most. But even as the crowd murmured in shock and disapproval, Sarah found herself thinking of the Jonas she knew. The man who'd spent evenings carving toys for her children. The man who'd shared his father's fishing gear because he wanted to make her life easier. The man who'd read poetry to Emma and taught Ben to identify different types of fish. Whatever had happened during the war, Sarah was certain there was more to the story than simple cowardice. "Mrs. McKenna," Marshal Brennan's voice cut through her thoughts. "You look like you have something to say." Sarah realized the entire crowd was watching her, waiting to see how the town's most gossiped-about widow would respond to news about her mysterious suitor. "I was wondering," Sarah said carefully, "what exactly this man is supposed to have done." "Abandoned his post during active engagement with Confederate forces," Brennan replied crisply. "Left his unit to face superior numbers while he ran for safety." The accusation was damning, but something in the marshal's tone struck Sarah as rehearsed. As if he'd told this story many times, perhaps embellishing it with each telling. "When did this happen?" she asked. "April 1864. Tennessee Theater." Sarah nodded politely, but her mind was working furiously. Jonas had mentioned being in Tennessee during the war, but he'd also spoken of his family dying in the cholera outbreak of summer 1864. If he'd truly deserted in April, how had he learned of his family's death and made it home in time for their funeral? "Thank you for the information, Marshal," Sarah said. "I'll certainly keep an eye out for anyone matching that description." Brennan's cold gaze lingered on her face. "See that you do, Ma'am. There's a substantial reward for information leading to this man's capture." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah caught Mrs. Patterson watching her with knowing eyes. The older woman approached with the satisfied expression of someone about to deliver unpleasant news. "I suppose this puts an end to your romantic notions," Mrs. Patterson said with false sympathy, "though I must say some of us suspected there was something unsavory about that mountain man." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Sarah replied. Evenly, "Come now, dear. Everyone knows you've been keeping company with him, daily fishing trips, him spending time with your children." "Really, Sarah? What were you thinking?" The criticism stung, but Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I was thinking that a man who's kind to my children and respectful to me deserves the benefit of the doubt, even if he's a deserter, a coward who abandoned his fellow soldiers." "If he is," Sarah said quietly, "I don't make judgments based on rumors and accusations." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "You're not seriously considering continuing this association?" "I'm seriously considering minding my own business," Sarah replied. "I'd suggest you do the same." She left Mrs. Patterson sputtering with indignation and headed home, her mind churning with questions and fears. By the time she reached her cabin, she'd made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was going to find Jonas and hear his side of the story. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah made her way up the mountain path she'd seen Jonas take countless times. She'd never visited his home, had never even asked where exactly he lived, but she was determined to find him before the marshal did. The climb was harder than she'd expected, especially in the growing darkness. More than once, she stumbled over roots or loose stones, her city-bred feet uncertain on the mountain terrain. But she pressed on, driven by a need to understand what was happening and protect the man she'd come to love. She found his cabin just as the moon crested the peaks. its silver light illuminating a simple but well-built structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows, creating an unexpectedly welcoming scene. Jonas appeared in the doorway before she could knock, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. "Sarah, what are you doing here? Is everything all right? The children are fine," Sarah said quickly. "Jonas, we need to talk." He stepped aside to let her enter, and Sarah found herself in a cabin that was both rustic and comfortable. Hand-hewn furniture filled the space, and bookshelves lined one wall. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, reflecting the same attention to detail she'd seen in his fishing gear and wood carvings. "Coffee?" Jonas offered, moving toward the fireplace where a pot hung over the coals. "Jonas, there's a federal marshal in town looking for you." Jonas froze, his back still turned toward her. When he finally faced her, his expression was carefully controlled, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. "What did he tell you?" Jonas asked quietly. "That you deserted your post in Tennessee, that you abandoned your unit during battle?" Jonas was silent for a long moment, then moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unwrapped it, Sarah saw a military medal, bronze and tarnished, but unmistakably a decoration for valor. "This is what the army gave me for the action where I supposedly deserted," Jonas said, his voice bitter. "The same day I supposedly ran away to save my own skin." Sarah stared at the medal, confusion warring with relief. "I don't understand." Jonas sank into a chair across from her, the medal heavy in his hands. "April 15th, 1864. We were scouting ahead of Sherman's column when we came across a Confederate detachment attacking a settlement. Civilians, families with children." Sarah could see the pain in his eyes as he remembered. "My orders were to report back to the main force and wait for reinforcements. But by the time help arrived, those families would have been dead." Jonas's voice grew rough with emotion. "So I disobeyed orders, took my men and engaged the enemy directly. And we saved the settlement, drove off the Confederates with minimal casualties on our side. The army commended our actions and gave us these medals." He held up the bronze decoration. "But my commanding officer was furious that I disobeyed direct orders." Sarah began to understand. He reported it as desertion. Major Harrison was a by-the-book officer who cared more about military protocol than civilian lives. When I refused to apologize for saving those families, he marked my record with charges of abandoning my post. "But you were decorated for the same action." Jonas nodded grimly. "Different officers, different perspectives. The field commander saw heroism. Harrison saw insubordination. Both reports went into my file. And now someone's decided to pursue the charges. Probably Harrison himself. He made general after the war, and he's never forgiven me for making him look bad." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that Jonas was exactly the man she'd believed him to be, someone who would risk everything to protect the innocent. Anger that he was being persecuted for doing what was right. "What happens if they catch you?" Jonas set the medal aside, his expression grim. "Court-martial, probably. If they convict on the desertion charges, it could mean prison time. At minimum, it would destroy any chance of a normal life. Then we have to make sure they don't catch you." The words surprised Sarah as much as they seemed to surprise Jonas. She hadn't consciously decided to help him evade the law, but sitting here in his cabin, seeing the medal that proved his courage, knowing the man he truly was, the choice felt inevitable. "Sarah," Jonas said carefully, "if you help me, you could face charges yourself." The marshal made it clear that anyone aiding a fugitive would be prosecuted. "Then we'll have to be very careful not to get caught." Jonas stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something like wonder in his eyes. "You believe me about what really happened?" "Jonas, I've watched you with my children for weeks. I've seen your kindness, your integrity, your protective instincts. The idea that you would abandon innocent people to save yourself is absurd. The marshal seemed convinced. The marshal doesn't know you. I do. Sarah leaned forward, taking his hands in hers. The man who carved toys for my children, who shared his father's fishing gear with a struggling widow, who reads poetry to an 8-year-old girl. That man would never abandon civilians in danger. Tears gathered in Jonas's eyes. I thought, when you learned about this, you'd want nothing more to do with me. Then you don't know me very well either. Sarah squeezed his hands. Jonas Fletcher, I agreed to marry you. I don't break my promises, and I don't abandon the people I love when they're in trouble. Even if it means becoming a fugitive yourself. Sarah thought of her children, safe in their beds, trusting her to make the right choice. She thought of the life she'd been building with Jonas, the future they'd planned together. She thought of the man who'd shown her that love didn't care what you smelled like, who'd given her back her sense of worth and hope. Even then, she said firmly, we're in this together now, Jonas, for better or worse, remember. Jonas pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly against his chest. Sarah could feel his heart beating rapidly, could sense the mixture of fear and gratitude and love that filled him. What do we do? He whispered against her hair. Sarah pulled back to look at him, seeing not a fugitive or a deserter, but the man who'd become essential to her happiness and her children's security. We figure out how to prove your innocence, she said, and until we can, we keep you safe. As they began to plan, Sarah realized she'd crossed another threshold in her relationship with Jonas. It was one thing to love someone when life was simple, another entirely to stand by them when everything was at stake. But sitting in his cabin, surrounded by evidence of the careful, thoughtful life he'd built, she knew she'd made the right choice. Jonas Fletcher was worth fighting for, worth risking for, even if it meant taking on the entire United States Army to do it. The pressed wildflower appeared in Sarah's Bible 2 days after her clandestine visit to Jonas's cabin. She discovered it that evening while reading to the children, a delicate mountain bloom flattened between the pages of Psalms, with a note in Jonas's careful handwriting, "For courage in dark times." Sarah's heart clenched as she realized what the flower represented. Jonas was preparing to leave. Despite her promises to help him fight the charges, despite their plans to prove his innocence, he was already saying goodbye in his quiet way. The next morning brought confirmation of her fears. Jonas wasn't at their usual fishing spot, nor did he appear as the hours passed. By afternoon, Sarah knew with sickening certainty that he'd made the decision she'd been dreading, to disappear into the mountains rather than risk bringing trouble. To her and the children, "Where's Papa Jonas?" Ben asked for the 10th time, his small face creased with worry. "He's probably just busy today," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But Emma, always too perceptive for her age, wasn't. "Fooled, he's gone, isn't he?" Emma said quietly, while Ben played with his wooden horse nearby. "Because of that marshal." Sarah met her daughter's knowing eyes and saw no point in lying. "I think he might be. Are you going to find him?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Finding Jonas would mean leaving the children, venturing into unfamiliar mountain territory, and confronting a man who'd clearly decided that protecting her was more important than staying with her. "I don't know where to look," Sarah admitted. "I do," Emma said simply. Sarah stared at her 8-year-old daughter. "What do you mean?" The day he taught Ben to whistle, he pointed to a valley up the mountain. Said it was where he went when he needed to think. Said it had a view of the whole world. Hope flared in Sarah's chest. It wasn't much, but it was something, a direction, a possibility. "Emma, if I were to go looking for him, we'd be fine," Emma interrupted firmly. "I can take care of Ben and Mary for one night. I've done it before." The reminder of those awful 2 weeks after Thomas's death, when Emma had indeed cared for her siblings while Sarah fell apart, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Her eldest daughter had already shouldered too much responsibility for her age. "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Emma's voice carried a maturity that made Sarah's heart ache. Papa Jonas makes you happy, Mama. He makes all of us happy. If he's gone because he thinks he's protecting us, then someone needs to tell him he's wrong. That evening, after the children were settled for the night, Sarah made her preparations. She packed food, water, and warm clothes, along with Thomas's old hunting rifle, not because she intended to use it, but because the mountains held dangers beyond human ones. As she prepared to leave, Emma appeared in the doorway of her bedroom. "Mama," Emma said softly, "take this." She held out Thomas's Bible, the same book where Jonas had pressed the wildflower. Sarah understood immediately. If Jonas needed proof that she wasn't abandoning her late husband's memory, but rather honoring it by choosing to love again, the Bible would provide it. "You're very wise for someone so young," Sarah murmured, accepting the book. "I had a good teacher," Emma replied with a small smile. The journey up the mountain in the pre-dawn darkness was treacherous and terrifying. Sarah had never ventured so far into the wilderness alone, had never relied solely on her own navigation and survival skills. More than once she considered turning back, convinced she was lost or heading in the wrong direction. But each time, doubt threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of Jonas alone, somewhere in these mountains, believing he was protecting her by sacrificing his own happiness. The image gave her strength to continue climbing. She found the valley Emma had described just as the sun crested the peaks, painting the mountainside in shades of gold and rose. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a hidden bowl of meadowland surrounded by towering evergreens, with a crystal-clear stream running through its center, and there, sitting on a fallen log with his back to the trail, was Jonas. He looked older somehow, his shoulders bowed with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the defeat in his posture. "Jonas," she called softly. He spun around, his face cycling through surprise, joy, and then anguish, in rapid succession. "Sarah, what are you doing here? You shouldn't have come. It's not safe. It's not safe for you either," Sarah replied, approaching slowly. "Yet, here we both are." Jonas stood abruptly, backing away from her. "You have to go back if the marshal finds you here with me. The marshal doesn't know about this place. He could follow your trail, question the children about where you've gone. Jonas." Sarah's firm tone stopped his panicked protests. "Stop! You don't understand the danger. I understand perfectly." Sarah closed the distance between them, noting the way he flinched as if her nearness caused physical pain. "I understand that you're so afraid of bringing trouble to me and the children that you're willing to sacrifice our future together. I'm trying to protect you. By breaking your promise to marry me? By abandoning the children who've already lost one father?" Sarah's voice grew heated. "By deciding what's best for all of us, without consulting any of us?" Jonas's face crumpled. "I can't put you in danger, Sarah. I can't risk the marshal arresting you for harboring a fugitive. I can't watch your children suffer because their mother chose to protect a wanted man. And I can't watch the man I love destroy himself trying to be noble." Sarah pulled Thomas's Bible from her pack, opening it to the page where the wildflower lay pressed. "You left this for me." Jonas stared at the delicate bloom, his throat working with emotion. "Thought you should have something to remember." "I don't want to remember you, Jonas. I want to build a life with you." Sarah closed the Bible, holding it against her chest. "Do you know what this book represents?" "Your late husband's memory." "It represents faith," Sarah corrected. "Faith that love is stronger than fear, that hope is more powerful than despair, that good people can overcome the challenges they face if they face them together." Jonas shook his head. "The charges against me are real, Sarah. Even if we could prove what really happened, the process could take months or years, and if we can't prove it, then we'll face whatever comes next together." Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in his eyes. "Jonas, do you remember what you told me about love not caring what someone smells like? That's different." "No, it's not. Love doesn't care about convenient timing or perfect circumstances or the absence of risk. Love cares about truth and commitment and choosing each other despite the obstacles. But the children are heartbroken. Ben keeps asking where his Papa Jonas has gone. Emma's trying to be brave, but I can see she's scared you've abandoned us. And Mary, Sarah's voice broke slightly, Mary keeps looking toward the creek, watching for you to appear. Jonas's resolve cracked visibly at the mention of the children's distress. I thought if I left quietly it would be easier for them. There's nothing easy about losing someone you love, whether they die or simply disappear. The pain is the same. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, his internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we stop running and start fighting. I'm suggesting we find a way to clear your name instead of hiding from false charges. I'm suggesting we trust each other enough to face this together. And if we fail, if they convict me anyway. Sarah reached for his hands, relieved when he didn't pull away. Then we'll have tried. And that's more than we'll have if you disappear into these mountains and spend the rest of your life hiding. Sarah, I can't ask. You two, you're not asking, I'm choosing. Sarah squeezed his hands. Just like I chose to fish that deeper pool you showed me, even though the current was stronger. Just like I chose to accept your courtship, even though the townspeople disapproved. Just like I chose to love you, even though it meant risking my heart again. Jonas was quiet for a long time, studying their joined hands. When he finally looked up, Sarah saw something like hope beginning to replace the despair in his eyes. How? He asked simply. We start by going back to town and facing this head-on. We find witnesses who can testify to what really happened in Tennessee. We get copies of your military records, including the commendation. We make them prove their case instead of hiding and letting them assume guilt. That's dangerous for you. Living without you is dangerous for me too, Sarah said softly. My heart can't survive losing someone else I love, Jonas, and my children can't survive losing another father, especially not to fear and false accusations. Jonas pulled his hands free and turned toward the valley, his gaze sweeping across the pristine landscape. I came here to think, he said quietly, to try to figure out the right thing to do. And what did you decide? That I'm tired of running, tired of letting other people's version of events define who I am. He turned back to her, and Sarah saw determination replacing the defeated weariness. That maybe it's time to fight. Then, you'll come back? Jonas stepped closer, framing her face with his large, gentle hands. Sarah McKenna, you are the bravest woman I've ever known. You came up this mountain alone to find me. You're willing to risk everything to help clear my name, and you've convinced 3 children to love a man they barely know. They know you, Sarah corrected. They know your heart, and that's what matters. If we do this, if we go back and fight these charges, there's no guarantee we'll win. There's a guarantee we'll lose if we don't try. Jonas smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the marshal's arrival. When did you become so wise? When I fell in love with a man who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. Jonas kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Sarah saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. All right, Jonas said. Let's go home and face whatever comes next. As they began the journey back down the mountain, Sarah felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the resolution of their immediate crisis. She'd found Jonas, convinced him to return, and proven to both of them that their love was strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. But more than that, she'd discovered something about herself in the process. The woman who'd climbed this mountain alone in the dark wasn't the same desperate widow who'd been fishing for survival just months ago. She was someone who fought for what mattered, who chose courage over safety, who understood that real love meant standing together against whatever threatened to tear them apart. Sarah, Jonas said, as they picked their way carefully down the rocky trail, There's something else I need to tell you about my past." Sarah's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it?" "The reason I really came west after the war. It wasn't just about losing my family to cholera." They paused on a flat section of the trail, and Jonas turned to face her, his expression serious. "After my parents died, after I buried them and sold the farm, I was angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. I'd spent 3 years fighting a war that was supposed to preserve the Union, supposed to make the world better, and while I was gone, disease took the only people who mattered to me." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. "I blamed everyone. The army for keeping me away, God for allowing it to happen, myself for not being there when they needed me. That anger ate at me for months. I drank too much, started fights in taverns, nearly killed a man in Kansas who said something disparaging about Union soldiers." "But you didn't kill him." "No, but I came close. Close enough to realize I was becoming someone my parents would have been ashamed of." Jonas's voice grew quiet. "That's when I decided to come to the mountains, not just to escape civilization, but to escape the man I was becoming." Sarah felt a rush of understanding. "You were grieving. I was destroying myself, and I was afraid that if I stayed around people, I'd destroy someone else too." "Jonas, that was 7 years ago. You're not that man anymore. How can you be sure?" Sarah thought of all the ways Jonas had shown his true character, his patience with her children, his gentle courtship, his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness to protect her from scandal. "Because I've seen who you really are," she said. "The man who carved toys for my children isn't capable of senseless violence. The man who reads poetry and shares his father's fishing gear isn't driven by anger anymore." But what if the stress of these charges, of being hunted, brings that anger back? The question revealed the depth of Jonas's fear, not just of the legal consequences he faced, but of who he might become under pressure. "Then I'll remind you who you really are," Sarah said simply. "Just like you reminded me that I was more than my circumstances, that my struggle was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of." Jonas stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw the last of his resistance crumble. "I don't deserve you," he said softly. "You're right," Sarah replied with a smile. "You deserve better. You deserve someone who doesn't come with 3 children and a reputation for smelling like fish, but you're stuck with me anyway." Jonas laughed, the first genuinely happy sound she'd heard from him in days. "Stuck with you? Sarah McKenna, I consider myself the luckiest man in Colorado." As they continued down the mountain, the conversation turned to practical matters. How to approach the marshal, what evidence they might be able to gather, whether Jonas should turn himself in or continue avoiding capture while they built their case. "I think," Sarah said as her cabin came into view below them, "we need help, someone with legal knowledge, someone who understands military procedure. The nearest lawyer is probably in Denver. Then we'll go to Denver if we have to. But first, let's see what we can learn about this Marshal Brennan. Something about him bothered me. The way he told your story, like he'd rehearsed it." Jonas nodded thoughtfully. "You think he might have reasons for pursuing this beyond simple law enforcement?" "I think men don't usually chase 7-year-old desertion charges unless they have personal motivation." They were within sight of the cabin now, and Sarah could see smoke rising from the chimney. Emma had kept the fire going, proving once again her remarkable capability. "Jonas," Sarah said, stopping him with a hand on his arm, "before we go in, I need to know you're committed to this, to fighting, to staying, to building the life we planned together. Are you having doubts?" "No, but I need to know you won't. Run again if things get difficult. My children can't handle losing you twice." Jonas took her hands in his brown eyes serious. "Sarah, I swear to you, on my parents' memory, on everything I hold sacred, I will not run again. Whatever happens, we face it together, even if it means prison, even if it means prison. Though I'm hoping your plan to prove my innocence works. Better than that." Sarah smiled and stood on her toes to kiss him. "It will. It has to. As they approached the cabin, the door flew open and 3 small figures came running out. Ben reached them first, throwing himself into Jonas's arms with a cry of joy. "Papa Jonas, you came back!" Emma followed more sedately, but her relief was evident in her tear-bright eyes. "I told you Mama would find you." Jonas knelt to gather all 3 children in his arms, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry I scared you," he said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." "Don't go away again," Mary babbled, patting Jonas's beard with her small hands. "I won't," Jonas promised, meeting Sarah's eyes over the children's heads. "We're a family now. Families stick together." That evening, after the children were asleep and the dishes were washed, Sarah and Jonas sat by the fire making plans. They would start by visiting the town records office, looking for any information about Marshal Brennan's background and motivations. They would write letters to Jonas's former commanding officers, seeking testimony about his character and service. Record. They would gather witnesses who could speak to the man he was now, regardless of what he might have been accused of in the past. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees of success. But sitting there in the warm glow of the firelight, planning their fight for their future, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. Jonas Fletcher might be wanted by the law, might face serious charges, might have a past marked by loss and anger. But he was also the man who'd given her back her sense of worth, who'd shown her children what a loving father looked like, who'd chosen to love her exactly as she was. And Sarah McKenna, widow and mother and woman who smelled like fish, was going to fight for him with every bit of strength and courage she possessed. Because that's what love did. It fought, it endured, it chose hope over fear and faith over doubt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, they were together. They were planning their future, and they were committed to seeing it through no matter what the cost. For the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah fell asleep, feeling truly hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The wanted poster changed everything. Sarah found it 3 days later, yellowed and water-stained, tucked inside a bundle of old newspapers Mr. Henderson was using to wrap purchases at the general store. She almost missed it entirely, would have, if the wind hadn't caught the edge of the paper and revealed a portion of the text beneath. "Wanted for desertion," the header read in bold letters. But it was the photograph below that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. The man in the picture looked like Jonas. Same height, same build, same general features, but the eyes were different. Harder. Cold in a way that Jonas's had never been. And the name printed below wasn't Jonas Fletcher at all. It was Jacob Fulton. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully extracted the poster from the bundle, her mind racing with implications. Either Jonas had lied to her about his identity, or Marshal Brennan was hunting the wrong man entirely. "Mrs. McKenna, is everything all right?" Mr. Henderson's concerned voice broke through her shock. "This poster," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where did it come from?" Henderson glanced at the paper in her hands, his expression growing uncomfortable. "Found it in a shipment of supplies from back east. Old thing, been kicking around for months probably." "Why?" "No reason," Sarah lied, folding the poster carefully and tucking it into her coat. "Just curious." The walk home felt endless. Sarah's mind churning with questions and possibilities. The photograph was definitely not Jonas. She was certain of that much. The facial structure was similar but wrong in subtle ways that became more obvious the longer she studied it. But the physical description matched perfectly. 6 feet 4 inches, dark hair, brown eyes, approximately 200 pounds, maybe using the alias Jonas Fletcher. That last line was what terrified her most. If Jonas Fletcher was indeed an alias, then who was the man she'd fallen in love with? And what was his connection to this Jacob Fulton? She found Jonas at their usual spot by the creek, teaching Ben the proper way to tie a fishing knot. The sight of him, patient, gentle, completely absorbed in her son's education, should have been reassuring. Instead, it made her heart ache with uncertainty. "Jonas," she called softly. He looked up with a smile that transformed his face, but Sarah saw the expression falter when he noticed her serious demeanor. "Children, why don't you go collect some smooth stones for your collection?" Sarah suggested. "Stay where we can see you." When they were alone, Sarah pulled out the wanted poster with hands that still shook slightly. "I need you to explain this." Jonas took the paper, his face going pale as he studied the photograph and text. For a long moment he was silent, and Sarah felt her worst fears beginning to crystallize. "This isn't me," Jonas said finally. "I know that, but they think it is. The description, the alias. Someone believes you're this Jacob Fulton." Jonas sank onto their usual log, the poster clutched in his hands. "Jacob was my cousin, my mother's sister's boy." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by a new wave of concern. "Was? He died in Tennessee, same engagement where I supposedly deserted. We were both scouts in the same unit." Jonas's voice grew rough with old pain. "Jacob was different from me, harder. The war had changed him in ways that scared me sometimes." "What happened to him?" Jonas stared at the photograph, his jaw tight with emotion. "The day we came across that settlement under attack, Jacob wanted to follow orders. Said the civilians weren't our problem, that we should report back and let someone else handle it." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. "But you disagreed." "I told him I was going to help those families whether he came with me or not. Jacob called me a fool, said I'd get us all killed for strangers who meant nothing to us." Jonas paused, pain flickering across his features. "He was probably right, from a military standpoint. But you went anyway. I went anyway. And Jacob..." Jonas's voice broke slightly. "Jacob came with me, not because he cared about the civilians, but because he wouldn't let me face the enemy alone. He died protecting the settlement. He died protecting me. Took a Confederate bullet that was meant for my back." Jonas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Last thing he said was that I'd better make it worth it. Saving those people, I mean." Sarah felt her heart breaking for the pain in Jonas's voice. "I'm so sorry. After the battle, after we'd driven off the attackers, I found Jacob's body. He looked so much like me that for a moment the other soldiers thought I was the one who'd been killed." Jonas looked up at her, his brown eyes haunted. "Maybe I should have been." "Don't say that. Jacob died because of my choice to disobey orders. His blood is on my hands. His blood is on the hands of the men who shot him," Sarah said firmly. "You didn't kill your cousin, Jonas. You made a moral choice to save innocent lives, and he chose to stand with you despite his reservations. That makes him a hero too." Jonas stared at the poster again. "After the battle, there was confusion about who had done what. Jacob and I looked enough alike that witnesses sometimes mixed up our actions. When the field reports were written, some of them credited me with things Jacob had done, and vice versa, including the desertion charge. Must be, if someone was determined to find Jacob Fulton for desertion, and if they had reports saying Jonas Fletcher was Jacob's alias." Jonas shook his head. "They'd assume I was their man." Sarah felt anger building in her chest. "So you're being hunted for your dead cousin's supposed crimes?" "Looks that way. Then we have proof of your innocence. Death records, burial documentation, witness testimony." "Sarah..." Jonas's quiet voice stopped her planning. "There's something else." The tone made her stomach clench with dread. "What?" "Jacob really was a deserter. Not that day. He died fighting alongside me. But 2 weeks earlier, he'd left his post during a skirmish. Came back the next morning with some story about getting lost in the woods, but everyone knew he'd run." Sarah stared at him. "So the charges against Jacob Fulton are real?" "The charges are real, but they're not against me, and Jacob died before he could face them." Jonas met her eyes. "The question is whether anyone will believe that when I look so much like him, and I've been using the name they think is his alias." The complexity of the situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jonas was innocent of the charges against him, but proving that innocence would require convincing authorities that he was not the man they thought he was, despite the physical resemblance and the name confusion that had apparently persisted. For 7 years, we need to find Jacob's grave, Sarah said suddenly. What? If we can prove Jacob Fulton died in Tennessee in 1864, we can prove you're not him. Death records, burial site, maybe even witnesses from the battle who can testify about which cousin did what. Jonas looked at her with something like wonder. You really believe we can sort this out? I believe the truth is the truth, regardless of how complicated it's become. Sarah reached for his hands. Jonas, look at me. Are you Jacob Fulton? No. Have you ever deserted your post? No, I disobeyed orders to save civilian lives, but I never abandoned my duties. Then we fight. We prove who you really are and clear your name. Jonas squeezed her hands. It won't be easy. Military records from that time are scattered. Witnesses are hard to find. And Marshal Brennan seems determined to close this case. Why is he so determined? That's been bothering me since he arrived. Jonas frowned thoughtfully. I don't know. 7-year-old desertion cases aren't usually high priority for federal marshals, unless there's something personal about it. Sarah studied the wanted poster again. Jonas, what if Brennan knew Jacob? What if he has reasons for wanting Jacob found that go beyond simple law enforcement? Like what? I don't know. But men don't usually spend years hunting dead deserters unless they have personal stakes in the outcome. Before Jonas could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Sarah quickly folded the poster and tucked it away as Marshal Brennan rode into view, accompanied by 2 armed deputies. Mr. Fletcher, Brennan called out, his hand resting meaningfully on his weapon. I think it's time we had a talk. Jonas stood slowly, positioning himself between the Marshal and Sarah's children, who had stopped playing and were watching the scene with frightened eyes. Marshal, Jonas said evenly, is there something I can do for you? You can start by placing your hands where I can see them and coming with me peacefully. On what charges? Brennan's smile was cold. I think you know exactly what charges, Jacob. The use of the wrong name confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Brennan was convinced he was arresting Jacob Fulton, but it also gave her an idea. There must be some mistake, Sarah said, stepping forward despite Jonas's protective gesture. This man's name is Jonas Fletcher. Ma'am, I appreciate your loyalty to your friend, but this man is a wanted fugitive. He's been using that alias for years. Can you prove that? Sarah challenged. Brennan's eyes narrowed. I don't need to prove it to you, ma'am. I have federal authority to arrest this man. But you need to prove it to a judge, don't you? You need to prove that Jonas Fletcher is actually Jacob Fulton and that Jacob Fulton is guilty of the charges against him. The resemblance to the wanted poster is sufficient. Resemblance isn't proof, Sarah interrupted. And if you're wrong, if this man isn't who you think he is, then you're arresting an innocent man. Jonas looked at her with surprise and admiration. Sarah was buying them time, creating doubt where Brennan expected compliance. Ma'am, Brennan said through gritted teeth, you're interfering with federal business. I'm asking questions that need to be asked before you destroy an innocent man's life. The marshal's frustration was evident, but Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. Good. The more doubt she could sow, the better their chances of avoiding immediate arrest. Jonas, she said quietly, tell the marshal about your military service record. Jonas straightened, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. I served as a cavalry scout under Captain Morrison, 5th Illinois Volunteer Cavalry, participated in the Tennessee Campaign, Sherman's March, and the Carolina Campaign, commended for valor in action near Murfreesboro. Anyone can memorize a service record, Brennan said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Anyone can accuse an innocent man of crimes he didn't commit, Sarah countered. The question is whether you're interested in justice or just closing a case. Brennan's hand tightened on his weapon, and Sarah realized she might have pushed too far. But before the confrontation could escalate further, Emma stepped forward. "Please don't hurt Papa Jonas," she said in a small, brave voice. "He reads to us and teaches us things and takes care of Mama." The sight of a child defending Jonas seemed to give Brennan pause. He looked from Emma to Jonas to Sarah, his jaw working with frustration. "I'm placing you under arrest," he said finally. "You can argue your innocence to a judge." "Where?" Sarah asked quickly. "Denver, Federal Courthouse." "Then we'll see you there," Sarah said, "with evidence that will prove your mistake." As Brennan's deputies moved to arrest Jonas, Sarah felt her heart breaking. But she also felt something else. Determination. They had information. Now, a direction for their investigation. Jacob Fulton was dead, and they were going to prove it. Jonas caught her eyes as the handcuffs clicked into place. "Take care of the children," he said quietly. "I'll take care of everything," Sarah replied, "including proving your innocence." As they led Jonas away, Sarah gathered her children close and watched the man she loved disappear around a bend in the trail. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something like hope. They had the truth on their side. Now, they just had to prove it. And Sarah McKenna, the woman who'd learned to fight for survival one fish at a time, was ready for the biggest fight of her life. Thomas's rifle felt heavier than Sarah remembered as she cleaned it by lamplight, her children finally asleep after hours of questions she couldn't fully answer. The weight wasn't just physical. It carried the memory of her late husband's steady hands, his quiet strength, his promise to always protect his family. Now that protection fell to her alone. 2 days had passed since Marshal Brennan arrested Jonas, 2 days of frantic preparation and growing determination. Sarah had sent letters to every military office she could think of, requesting service records for both Jonas Fletcher and Jacob Fulton. She'd contacted the newspaper in the nearest Tennessee town, asking about battle records from 1864. She'd even written to the War Department in Washington, though she doubted her inquiry would receive prompt attention. But letters took time, and Jonas didn't have time. The federal court in Denver convened in 1 week, and Brennan seemed determined to rush the case through before any inconvenient evidence could surface, which meant Sarah was going to Denver. "The plan is dangerous," she murmured to herself, checking the rifle's mechanism one more time. The weapon had belonged to Thomas's father, passed down through generations of McKenna men who'd used it to protect their families. Now it would protect hers. The sound of a wagon approaching interrupted her thoughts. Sarah quickly set the rifle aside and peered through the window, recognizing the familiar outline of Dr. Samuel Morrison, Jonas's former commanding officer, who'd received her urgent telegram and ridden hard from his practice in Colorado Springs. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, grateful to see the steady-eyed man who'd vouched for Jonas's character in his return wire. "Mrs. McKenna," Dr. Morrison said, removing his hat as he entered. "I came as quickly as I could. Thank you for coming. I know it's a great deal to ask. Jonas Fletcher saved my life at Murfreesboro," Morrison said simply. "If he's in trouble, then I'm here to help." Relief flooded through Sarah. Having Jonas's former captain willing to testify would lend credibility to their case that no amount of documentation could match. "There's something else," Morrison continued, reaching into his coat. "I brought these." He handed Sarah a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be official military documents. Jonas's complete service record, including the commendation for Murfreesboro and documentation of his cousin Jacob's death. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the papers. There it was in black and white, Jacob Fulton's death certificate, signed by the unit's medic and countersigned by Morrison himself. Death by enemy fire during action to protect civilian settlement, April 15, 1864. "This proves everything," Sarah breathed. "It proves Jonas isn't Jacob," Morrison agreed. "But proving innocence in a federal court requires more than documentation. We need to discredit the charges themselves and the marshal pursuing them. What do you mean? Morrison's expression grew grim. I did some investigating after receiving your telegram. Marshal Brennan isn't just pursuing an old desertion case, he's pursuing a personal vendetta. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Against Jonas? Against Jacob Fulton. Brennan served as a lieutenant in the same theater. His younger brother was killed. During a Confederate raid, the Jacobs unit failed to stop because Jacob had deserted his post the night before. The pieces began falling into place. So Brennan blames Jacob for his brother's death, and he's been hunting Jacob ever since. When reports surfaced of a man matching Jacob's description using the name Jonas Fletcher, Brennan assumed he'd found his target. But Jacob's been dead for 7 years. Dead men don't satisfy vengeance. Brennan needs someone to blame, someone to punish for his brother's death. Jonas is convenient. Sarah stared at the documents in her hands, understanding the true scope of what they faced. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a grieving man's quest for justice against someone who couldn't be brought to justice because he was already dead. What do we do? She asked. We go to Denver, present the evidence, and hope the judge values truth over a marshal's desire for closure. Morrison paused. But Mrs. McKenna, you should know, Brennan won't give up easily. Men like him, driven by grief and anger, don't accept evidence that contradicts their need for retribution. Are you saying he might try to prevent the truth from coming out? I'm saying we need to be very careful, and we need to be prepared for the possibility that legal channels might not be enough. Sarah thought of Jonas sitting in a Denver jail cell, probably wondering if she'd abandoned him to his fate. The idea of him facing trial alone, convicted of his dead cousin's crimes because a grieving marshal needed someone to blame, filled her with a cold fury she'd never experienced before. Dr. Morrison, she said quietly, what would happen if Jonas simply disappeared before the trial? The former captain studied her face carefully. Are you asking me to help you break a federal prisoner out of jail? I'm asking you what would happen if I did it myself. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. It would make you both fugitives for the rest of your lives. You'd never be able to settle anywhere, never have a normal life. Your children would grow up on the run. And if we don't? If Jonas is convicted? Prison, certainly. Possibly years of it. Even if we eventually prove his innocence. Sarah looked toward the children's bedroom, thinking of Emma's fierce loyalty, Ben's innocent trust, Mary's complete acceptance of Jonas as her father. They'd already lost one parent. Could she let them lose another to a corrupt system seeking vengeance against a dead man? There's a third option, Morrison said carefully. What? We don't just prove Jonas's innocence, we prove Brennan's corruption. We expose his personal motives, his willingness to railroad an innocent man to satisfy his own need for revenge. How? Morrison smiled grimly. By making him reveal his true motivations in open court, by pushing him until his professional facade cracks and shows the grieving, angry man underneath. Sarah felt a spark of hope. You think it will work? I think truth has a way of surfacing when pressure is applied in the right places, but it's risky. If we fail, Jonas's situation becomes worse, not better. And if we don't try, then an innocent man goes to prison for his dead cousin's crimes. Sarah stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains where Jonas had lived in solitude for 7 years before she'd drawn him back into the world. Those peaks had been his refuge from human complications, from the risk of caring and losing. Now, because he'd chosen to love her and her children, he faced losing everything. Mrs. McKenna, Morrison said gently, there's something else you should consider. Even if we clear Jonas's name, even if we expose Brennan's corruption, the townspeople here will remember the scandal. They'll remember the arrest, the accusations, the trial. Life here might become difficult. Sarah had already considered that possibility. Small-town memories were long, and scandal clung to families for generations. Emma would face whispers about her stepfather's arrest. Ben and Mary would grow up under the shadow of questions about Jonas's past. "Then we'll go somewhere else," Sarah said simply. "Somewhere no one knows our history, where we can start fresh." "You'd be willing to leave everything behind?" Sarah thought of the life she'd built in this valley, the fishing routine that had sustained them, the cabin Thomas had built, the community that had grudgingly accepted her struggle to survive. All of it tied to memories of loss and hardship, of shame and desperate survival. "I'm not leaving everything behind," she said. "I'm taking everything that matters. Jonas and the children and the love we've found together. The rest is just scenery." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Then we go to Denver and fight for Jonas's freedom." "We go to Denver," Sarah agreed. "But first we prepare for war." The next morning, Sarah made arrangements for her children's care during her absence. Mrs. Henderson, despite her reservations about Sarah's association with Jonas, agreed to watch Emma, Ben, and Mary, partly from Christian duty, partly from genuine affection for the children. "You're taking a considerable risk," Mrs. Henderson said, as Sarah packed her few possessions. "Involving yourself in legal proceedings, traveling alone to Denver." "I'm fighting for my family," Sarah replied. "That's not a risk. It's a necessity. And if you lose, if this Jonas Fletcher really is the deserter they claim..." Sarah paused in her packing, meeting the older woman's concerned gaze. "Then I'll have fought for someone worth fighting for, and that's more than most people can say about their lives." As she prepared to leave, Emma pulled her aside with the serious expression of a child forced to grow up too quickly. "Mama, are you going to bring Papa Jonas home?" "I'm going to try, sweetheart. What if the bad men won't let him go?" Sarah knelt to her daughter's level, seeing Thomas's determination in Emma's young face. "Then Mama will find another way, because families don't abandon each other, no matter how hard things get." Emma nodded solemnly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden fish Jonas had carved for her weeks ago. "Take this, for luck." Sarah accepted the small carving, feeling its smooth weight in her palm. "I'll bring it back to you along with Papa Jonas." "Promise?" Sarah thought of all the promises she'd made and broken, all the certainties that had proven false, all the plans that had crumbled under the weight of circumstance. But looking into her daughter's trusting eyes, she found absolute conviction. "I promise." The journey to Denver took 2 days by wagon, Dr. Morrison driving, while Sarah rode beside him, Thomas's rifle secured beneath the seat. They talked strategy during the long hours, refining their approach and preparing for various contingencies. "The key," Morrison explained, "is to control the narrative. We present Jonas as a war hero wrongly accused, Brennan as a man corrupted by grief, and Jacob as the real deserter who paid for his crimes with his life. What if Brennan has evidence we don't know about? Then we adapt. But Sarah, you need to understand, once we walk into that courtroom, there's no turning back. Whatever happens, we see it through to the end." Sarah fingered Emma's wooden fish in her pocket, thinking of the children waiting for her return, of Jonas sitting in his cell, believing himself abandoned. "There was no turning back the moment I fell in love with him." Denver was larger and more chaotic than Sarah had expected, its streets crowded with miners, merchants, and drifters seeking fortune in the Colorado Territory. The federal courthouse stood like a monument to justice in the center of the business district, its stone facade promising impartiality and truth. Sarah hoped the promise would be kept. They found lodging at a modest hotel near the courthouse, then spent the evening reviewing their evidence and preparing their testimony. Morrison would speak to Jonas's character and military record. Sarah would testify about the man she'd known, the father he'd become to her children, the impossibility of reconciling his gentle nature with the crimes alleged against him. "Remember," Morrison said as they prepared to retire for the night, "Brennan will try to paint Jonas as a deserter and you as a foolish woman deceived by a smooth-talking criminal. Don't let him rattle you. "He's not the first man to underestimate me," Sarah replied, "and he won't be the last." But lying in her narrow hotel bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, Sarah felt fear creeping in around the edges of her determination. What if their evidence wasn't enough? What if the judge believed Brennan's version of events? What if she'd brought Jonas back from the mountains only to watch him be destroyed by a system that valued vengeance over truth? She reached for Emma's wooden fish, running her thumb over its carefully carved scales. Jonas had made this with his own hands, putting love and patience into every detail. The man capable of such gentle artistry wasn't capable of abandoning his duty or his fellow soldiers. Tomorrow, she would convince a federal judge of that truth. She would bring Jonas home to the children who loved him, to the life they'd planned together, to the future that belonged to them. And if the legal system failed them, well, Thomas's rifle was within reach, and Sarah McKenna had already proven she was willing to fight for what mattered most. The woman who'd once been ashamed of smelling like fish was about to show the world what she was really made of. The federal courthouse was already packed when Sarah arrived that morning, word of the deserter trial having spread through Denver's gossip networks like wildfire. She pushed through the crowd, Dr. Morrison at her side, her heart hammering as she caught her first glimpse of Jonas in federal custody. He sat at the defendant's table in ill-fitting prison clothes, his hands shackled, his usually neat hair disheveled from days in jail. But when their eyes met across the courtroom, his face transformed with relief and something deeper, absolute trust that she would find a way to save him. Sarah felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders like a mantle. She'd promised Emma she would bring Papa Jonas home. She'd sworn to Jonas that they would face this together. Now, surrounded by hostile faces and the machinery of federal justice, she had to make good on those promises. "Mrs. McKenna," a voice called softly. Sarah turned to see a thin, earnest-looking man approaching with a leather satchel. "I'm David Whitmore, the attorney Dr. Morrison arranged. Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, though ready felt like an inadequate word for the mixture of terror and determination coursing through her veins. "What do we need to know?" "Judge Hamilton is fair but old-fashioned. He doesn't like disruptions in his courtroom, and he has little patience for what he considers feminine hysteria. Present your evidence clearly and calmly, and let the facts speak for themselves." "And Brennan?" Whitmore's expression darkened. "Brennan's been working the crowd since dawn, telling anyone who'll listen about the dangerous deserter who's been living among decent people. He's painted this as a clear-cut case of military justice finally catching up with a coward." Sarah looked around the courtroom, noting the hostile faces, the whispered conversations that stopped when people noticed her looking. The crowd wanted blood. They wanted to see justice done against a man they'd been told was a traitor to his country. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hamilton," the bailiff called. The judge was exactly what Sarah had expected from Whitmore's description. Elderly, stern-faced, with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority in his domain. He settled behind the bench like a king taking his throne, his cold gaze sweeping the crowded courtroom. "Be seated," Judge Hamilton commanded. "We are here to try the case of the United States versus Jacob Fulton, also known as Jonas Fletcher, on charges of desertion during wartime. How does the defendant plead?" Jonas stood slowly, his shackles rattling in the sudden silence. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A murmur ran through the crowd, some approving, some skeptical. Sarah felt the hostile energy in the room, like a physical presence, pressing against her from all sides. "The prosecution may present its case," Judge Hamilton announced, martial. Brennan rose with the confident bearing of a man certain of victory. He was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Dark, intense, burning with an inner fire that spoke of obsession rather than simple duty. "Your Honor," Brennan began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "the case before us today is straightforward. On April 14, 1864, during active engagement with Confederate forces near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the defendant abandoned his post, leaving his fellow soldiers to face superior enemy numbers without support. Sarah felt Jonas tense beside her as Brennan painted his version of events. This act of cowardice resulted in unnecessary casualties among Union forces, including the death of my own brother, Lieutenant Samuel Brennan, who died trying to hold a position that should have had scout support. The personal revelation sent a shock through the courtroom. Sarah saw Judge Hamilton's eyebrows rise slightly. Apparently, he hadn't known about Brennan's personal connection to the case. Furthermore, Brennan continued, the defendant has spent the past 7 years living under an assumed identity, evading military justice, while honest soldiers who served with honor have had to live with the consequences of his betrayal. Brennan presented his evidence methodically. The wanted poster with its physical description, witness statements from soldiers who remembered a scout abandoning his post, and documentation of the Confederate attack that had resulted in his brother's death. Sarah watched the jury's faces as Brennan spoke, seeing belief and condemnation growing in their expressions. The marshal was a skilled prosecutor, weaving facts and emotion into a narrative that painted Jonas as both traitor and coward. The prosecution calls Dr. Samuel Morrison to the stand, Brennan announced. Sarah's heart lurched. Morrison was supposed to be their key witness, not Brennan's. But as the former captain took the stand, Sarah realized Brennan's strategy. By calling Morrison first, he could control the narrative and limit the doctor's ability to present exculpatory evidence. Dr. Morrison, Brennan began, you served as Captain Morrison in the 5th Illinois Volunteer Cavalry during the Civil War, correct? That's correct. And you were the commanding officer of both Jacob Fulton and the man calling himself Jonas Fletcher. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he answered truthfully, I commanded both men, yes. In your professional opinion, Doctor, are Jacob Fulton and Jonas Fletcher the same person? The question was a trap, and Sarah could see Morrison struggling with how to answer. If he said yes, he was confirming the prosecution's case. If he said no, Brennan could present evidence to contradict him and make him look like a liar. I can't definitively answer that question based on physical appearance alone, Morrison said carefully. But they do look remarkably similar, don't they? Similar enough that you might mistake one for the other? There was always a strong family resemblance between the cousins, yes. Brennan smiled coldly. Cousins? How convenient. Tell me, Doctor, did Jacob Fulton have a cousin who served in your unit? Yes. And what was this cousin's name? Morrison hesitated for a fraction of a second. Jonas Fletcher. I see. And where is this Jonas Fletcher now? Sarah watched Morrison's face, knowing he was about to lie under oath, and knowing he had no choice if they wanted to save the real Jonas. Jonas Fletcher died at Murfreesboro, Morrison said quietly. The same day as Jacob Fulton. Brennan's eyes lit up with triumph. So according to your testimony, both men died in 1864, yet here sits a man claiming to be Jonas Fletcher. How do you explain that, Doctor? The trap was sprung perfectly. Morrison had been forced to choose between two lies. Either Jonas was Jacob or the real Jonas was dead. Either way, Brennan had what he needed. Morrison struggled for words. Your honor, Attorney Whitmore interjected, rising from his seat. I object to this line of questioning. The prosecution is badgering the witness. Overruled, Judge Hamilton said curtly. The witness will answer the question. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest as she watched their carefully planned defense crumble under Brennan's assault. The marshal had outmaneuvered them, turning their key witness into evidence for the prosecution. Dr. Morrison, Brennan pressed, isn't it possible that you've been deceived? That the man you knew as Jonas Fletcher was actually Jacob Fulton using his cousin's identity? I suppose it's possible, Morrison admitted reluctantly. Sarah could see the jury's expressions hardening. Brennan had planted the seed of doubt. about Morrison's reliability, while simultaneously suggesting that Jonas had been using his dead cousin's identity for years. "No further questions," Brennan said, returning to his seat with the satisfied expression of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. Whitmore stood for cross-examination, but Sarah could see the desperation in his movements. Morrison had been compromised as a witness, and there was little the attorney could do to repair the damage. "Dr. Morrison," Whitmore began, "in all your interactions with the man you knew as Jonas Fletcher, did he ever demonstrate cowardice or disloyalty?" "Never. Jonas Fletcher was one of the bravest men I ever served with." "Can you describe his actions during the Murfreesboro engagement?" Morrison straightened, some of his confidence returning. "Jonas Fletcher led a small unit to protect civilian settlements under Confederate attack. His actions saved dozens of innocent lives, and he was commended for valor." "And Jacob Fulton? What were his actions during that engagement?" "Jacob Fulton died fighting alongside Jonas Fletcher, protecting those same civilians." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope as Morrison managed to work in the key facts of their defense. Both cousins had died heroes, not deserters, but Brennan wasn't finished. "Dr. Morrison," he called out, rising from his seat, "isn't it true that you've been in contact with the defendant's alleged fiancée? Isn't it true that she's influenced your testimony here today?" "Objection!" Whitmore shouted. "Sustained," Judge Hamilton ruled, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the implication that Morrison's testimony was tainted by his relationship with Sarah. As Morrison stepped down, Sarah realized they were losing. Brennan had systematically demolished their defense, turning their own witnesses against them. Unless something changed dramatically, Jonas would be convicted of his cousin's crimes. "The prosecution calls Mrs. Sarah McKenna to the stand," Brennan announced. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She hadn't expected to be called as a prosecution witness, but she realized Brennan's strategy. He would use her own testimony about Jonas's character to prove how completely the deserter had deceived her. As Sarah made her way to the witness stand, she caught Jonas's eyes. He looked stricken, realizing that Brennan was about to use her. Love against him. But Sarah gave him a slight nod, her jaw set with determination. Let Brennan call her as his witness. He was about to learn what a woman fighting for her family was capable of. The Bible felt heavy in her hands as she swore to tell the truth. Around her, the packed courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the widow would fare under cross-examination. "Mrs. McKenna," Brennan began, his voice deceptively gentle, "you've been keeping company with the defendant, haven't you?" "I've been courting with Jonas Fletcher, yes. And during this courtship, did he ever mention his military service?" "Briefly." "Did he tell you he was a war hero? That he'd been decorated for bravery?" Sarah hesitated, seeing the trap. "He mentioned receiving a commendation." "I see. And you believed him?" "I had no reason not to." Brennan smiled coldly. "Mrs. McKenna, isn't it true that you're a widow with 3 children, struggling to survive on the frontier?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that the defendant offered you security, protection, and assistance with providing for your family?" Sarah began to understand Brennan's strategy. He was painting her as a desperate woman, easily deceived by a smooth-talking criminal offering her what she needed most. "Jonas offered me companionship and support, yes. In fact, didn't he help improve your fishing technique, essentially increasing your ability to support yourself? He taught me better methods, yes. How generous of him. Tell me, Mrs. McKenna, what would happen to you and your children if this arrangement were to end?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Sarah realized Brennan was suggesting that her testimony was motivated by fear of losing Jonas's support rather than genuine belief in his innocence. "Marshal Brennan," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "are you asking me if I would lie, under oath to protect a man I believed was guilty? I'm asking if your judgment might be compromised by your circumstances. Sarah felt anger building in her chest. Not the hot, impulsive anger of youth, but the cold, focused fury of a woman who'd been pushed too far. My judgment, Marshall said, Brennan, has been shaped by 3 years of widowhood, 3 years of fighting to keep my children fed and clothed and safe. I've learned to read people very carefully because my family's survival has depended on it. Mrs. McKenna, I'm not finished, Sarah said firmly, ignoring Judge Hamilton's warning look. You want to know about my judgment? I can tell the difference between a man who helps because he wants something from me and a man who helps because he's genuinely kind. I can tell the difference between someone who tolerates my children and someone who loves them. And I can tell the difference between a coward and a hero. The courtroom was completely silent now, every person hanging on her words. Jonas Fletcher is not Jacob Fulton, Sarah continued, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. And if you had spent 5 minutes actually investigating this case instead of pursuing a personal vendetta, you would know that. Objection, Brennan shouted, his face flushing red. The witness is making inflammatory statements. Sustained, Judge Hamilton said sharply. Mrs. McKenna, you will limit your responses to answering the questions asked. But Sarah had accomplished what she'd intended. The entire courtroom had heard her accuse Brennan of pursuing a personal vendetta, and she'd seen several jury members exchange meaningful glances. No further questions, Brennan said through gritted teeth. As Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. She'd managed to plant seeds of doubt about Brennan's motives, but she wasn't sure. It would be enough. The prosecution rests, Brennan announced. Judge Hamilton looked to the defense table. Does the defense wish to present its case? Whitmore stood, his face pale but determined. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Jonas Fletcher to the stand. As Jonas rose and moved toward the witness stand, Sarah saw the mob-like energy building. In the courtroom, these people wanted a conviction, wanted to see justice done against the supposed deserter. The burning torch of their collective anger threatened to consume everything in its path, including the truth. But Sarah had lit a fire of her own. The fire of a woman's absolute conviction that the man she loved was innocent. And she intended to fan that flame until it burned away every lie Brennan had constructed. The real battle was just beginning. Jonas's testimony began quietly, his deep voice steady, despite the shackles that clinked softly whenever he moved his hands. Whitmore guided him through the basic facts, his real name, his service record, his relationship to Jacob Fulton, but Sarah could see the jury's skepticism. Brennan had done his work well. Mr. Fletcher, Whitmore said, please tell the court what happened on April 15, 1864, near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Jonas straightened in his chair, his military bearing evident despite his circumstances. My cousin Jacob and I were on reconnaissance when we discovered Confederate forces attacking a civilian settlement. Our orders were to report back and wait for reinforcements. But you didn't follow those orders? No, sir. By the time reinforcements arrived, those families would have been dead. I made the decision to engage the enemy immediately. And your cousin Jacob, what was his reaction to your decision? Jonas's voice grew thick with emotion. Jacob disagreed with my choice, said we should follow orders, that the civilians weren't our responsibility. But when I went anyway, he came with me. Why would he do that if he disagreed? Because he was family. Because he wouldn't let me face the enemy alone, even if he thought I was making a mistake. Sarah watched the jury as Jonas described the battle, the successful defense of the settlement, and Jacob's heroic death-saving civilians he'd initially wanted to abandon. She could see some faces softening, but others remained hard with suspicion. Mr. Fletcher, Whitmore continued, if your cousin died in 1864, how do you explain this? He produced the wanted poster, holding it up for the jury to see. The poster shows Jacob, not me. We looked similar. People often mistook us for each other. But we weren't the same person. Can you prove that? Before Jonas could answer, Brennan leaped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant can claim anything he wants about his identity. Without credible documentation, his testimony is worthless." Judge Hamilton frowned. "Does the defense have documentation to support the defendant's claims?" Whitmore reached for his briefcase, but before he could speak, Sarah stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice cutting through the courtroom murmur, "I have documentation." "Mrs. McKenna," Judge Hamilton said sharply, "you are not—" "I have Jacob Fulton's death certificate," Sarah continued, ignoring the judge's warning. "Signed by the unit medic and witnessed by Dr. Morrison. I have Jonas Fletcher's commendation for the same battle where Jacob died. I have letters from surviving members of their unit, all confirming that Jacob Fulton died a hero and Jonas Fletcher lived to continue serving his country." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Brennan spun around to stare at Sarah, his face pale with shock. "Furthermore," Sarah said, her voice rising above the noise, "I have evidence that Marshal Brennan has pursued this case not out of duty to justice, but out of personal vengeance for his brother's death, a death that occurred because Jacob Fulton had previously abandoned his post, not because Jonas Fletcher failed in his duties." "Order!" Judge Hamilton banged his gavel repeatedly. "Mrs. McKenna, sit down immediately or I'll hold you in contempt." But Sarah wasn't finished. 3 years of keeping quiet, of accepting other people's judgment, of feeling ashamed for circumstances beyond her control, had built up like water behind a dam. Now, the dam had burst. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos, "this entire proceeding is based on a lie. Marshal Brennan has been hunting a dead man for 7 years, and rather than admit his mistake, he's decided to convict an innocent man instead." "Bailiff!" Judge Hamilton shouted. "Remove this woman from my courtroom!" But as the bailiff moved toward Sarah, something unexpected happened. Dr. Morrison stood up. "Your Honor," Morrison said loudly, "the lady is telling the truth. I have Jacob Fulton's death certificate in my possession, along with Jonas Fletcher's complete service record." Before the judge could respond, another voice joined the chorus. "Judge Hamilton!" An elderly man in the back of the courtroom struggled to his feet. "I was there at Murfreesboro. I can testify that Jacob Fulton died saving civilians, and Jonas Fletcher was decorated for heroism." Then another voice. "I served with both men. They were cousins, not the same person." And another. "Brennan's been talking about his dead brother for years, swearing he'd get revenge." The courtroom dissolved into chaos as more voices joined the impromptu testimony. Sarah realized that word of the trial had brought out veterans from the Civil War, men who remembered the events at Murfreesboro, and the soldiers who'd fought there. Judge Hamilton banged his gavel furiously, but the voices continued to rise. Sarah watched Brennan's face cycle through shock, anger, and something that looked like panic as the foundation of his case crumbled before his eyes. "Enough!" the judge roared, standing behind his bench. "I will have order in my courtroom." Gradually, the voices died down, but the damage was done. The jury had heard multiple witnesses contradicting Brennan's version of events, and their expressions had shifted from suspicion to confusion to dawning understanding. "Marshal Brennan," Judge Hamilton said coldly, "approach the bench." Now, Sarah watched as Brennan walked stiffly to the judge's bench, his earlier confidence completely gone. She couldn't hear their whispered conversation, but she could see Brennan's shoulders slumping as Judge Hamilton spoke. When Brennan returned to his table, his face was ashen. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Hamilton announced, "new evidence has come to light that requires a recess while this court examines documentation relevant to this case. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." As the gavel fell, Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. They'd survived the first day, and more importantly, they'd managed to introduce doubt about the prosecution's case. But as the courtroom began, too empty, she noticed Brennan standing alone at his table, staring at Jonas with an expression of such hatred that it made her blood run cold. This wasn't over. A man driven by 7 years of grief and anger wouldn't give up just because a judge had questioned his evidence. That evening, in their hotel room, Sarah and Morrison spread the documentation across the small table, preparing their case for the next day's proceedings. "You took a tremendous risk today," Morrison said, as he organized witness statements, "interrupting a federal trial, making accusations against a U.S. Marshal. You could have been arrested. I couldn't let Jonas be convicted for someone else's crimes," Sarah replied, carefully checking each document. "Besides, someone had to say what everyone in that courtroom was thinking, which was that Brennan's story didn't make sense. Too many holes, too many convenient coincidences." Sarah held up Jacob's death certificate. "This proves Jacob Fulton died in 1864. Jonas's commendation proves he was the hero at Murfreesboro, not the deserter. And those veterans who spoke up, they remember the truth." Morrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Sarah, you need to be careful. Brennan's not going to accept defeat gracefully. A man who's spent 7 years pursuing vengeance doesn't just walk away when his case falls apart." "What do you mean?" Before Morrison could answer, a soft knock came at the door. Sarah opened it to find a young hotel clerk with a message. "For Mrs. McKenna," the clerk said, handing her an envelope before disappearing down the hallway. Sarah opened the message with trembling fingers, her heart sinking as she read the brief note. "Your children are safe for now. If you want them to stay that way, convince Fletcher to confess. You have until tomorrow morning. A friend." The paper fluttered from Sarah's nerveless fingers. Morrison picked it up, his face growing grim as he read. "Brennan," he said quietly. "He has my children?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "He must have sent men back to your town. Sarah, this changes everything." Sarah sank into a chair, her mind reeling. Emma, Ben, little Mary, all in the hands of men desperate enough to threaten. Children to get what they wanted. "I have to go back," she said, starting to rise. "No." Morrison's firm voice stopped her. "That's exactly what Brennan wants. He wants you to panic, to make mistakes, to pressure Jonas into confessing to crimes he didn't commit. But my children are safer than you think. Brennan can't actually hurt them without destroying his own career. He's bluffing, hoping you'll fold before he has to reveal how little power he actually has." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the fear for her children was overwhelming. "What if you're wrong? Then we finish this tomorrow. We present our evidence, prove Jonas's innocence, and destroy Brennan's case so completely that he has no choice but to release your children and face the consequences of his actions. And if we lose," Morrison met her eyes steadily, "then we find another way. But Sarah, we don't abandon the truth because someone threatens us. That's what men like Brennan count on, that good people will sacrifice justice to protect what they love." Sarah thought of Jonas in his jail cell, probably wondering why she hadn't visited that evening. She thought of her children, wherever they were, probably confused and frightened. She thought of the life they'd all been building together now, hanging by the thread of a federal court's decision. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "we end this." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah wondered if they would be enough. Brennan had shown he was willing to threaten innocent children to get what he wanted. How far would he go to avoid admitting he'd spent 7 years hunting a dead man? The answer, she feared, might be further than any of them imagined. 6 months. Later, Sarah stood in the doorway of their new cabin in the Montana Territory, watching Jonas teach Ben how to carve a whistle from mountain pine. The silver ring on her finger, crafted by Jonas from ore he'd found in the creek near their home, caught the afternoon sunlight and reminded her of how far they'd all traveled since that terrible day in the Denver courthouse. The trial's second day had ended with complete vindication. Judge Hamilton had examined the death certificate, the commendation letters, and testimony from 7 Civil War veterans who'd served with both cousins. Marshal Brennan's case had crumbled so completely that the judge had ordered an investigation into the marshal's conduct, ultimately resulting in Brennan's dismissal from federal service. The children had been returned safely within hours, They'd never been in real danger, just held by Brennan's deputies, who told them their mother needed them to wait in town until she returned. But the threat had been real enough to show how far a man driven by grief and anger could fall. "Mama!" Mary's voice interrupted Sarah's memories. At 2.5, she was talking more every day, and her favorite word was "papa" whenever she saw Jonas. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, kneeling to her daughter's level. "Papa say story tonight?" "If you ask him nicely, I'm sure Papa will tell you a story." The word papa came so naturally now that Sarah sometimes forgot Jonas hadn't always been part of their lives. The children had adapted to calling him Papa Jonas initially, but as the months passed and they'd settled into their new life, he'd simply become Papa, the only father Mary really remembered, the one who'd filled the void Thomas's death had left in all their hearts. "Sarah," Jonas called from the workshop he'd built behind their cabin, "come see what Emma's made." Sarah found her eldest daughter bent over a piece of wood, carving carefully with one of Jonas's smaller knives. The project was recognizably a fish, scales detailed with remarkable precision for an 8-year-old's work. "It's beautiful, Emma," Sarah said, admiring the craftsmanship. "You're getting almost as good as Papa Jonas." Emma beamed with pride. "He's teaching me to make a whole set. Ben's making horses, I'm making fish, and Papa said he'll help Mary make something special when she's older." The easy domesticity of the scene filled Sarah with contentment. After the trial, they decided to start fresh somewhere new, away from the memories and gossip that would have followed them in Colorado. Jonas had sold his mountain cabin and used the proceeds to buy land in a valley where no one knew their history, where they could simply be a family without explanation or justification. "Dinner's almost ready," Sarah announced. "Time to wash up." As the family gathered around their table that evening, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when she'd met the feared mountain man by the creek. The woman who'd been ashamed of smelling like fish was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love meant accepting people exactly as they were and being accepted in return. "Papa," Ben said, carefully cutting his meat with the knife Jonas had carved especially for him, "tell us about the war again." "Which part?" Jonas asked, though he knew Ben always wanted the same story. "The part where you and Uncle Jacob saved the families." Jonas glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. They'd decided early on to tell the children the truth about Jacob Fulton, that he'd been Jonas's cousin, who'd started as a deserter but died a hero, and that Jonas had been falsely accused of Jacob's crimes. It was important for the children to understand that people were complex, that redemption was always possible, and that sometimes the justice system made mistakes. "Well," Jonas began, settling back in his chair, "Jacob wasn't sure we should help those families at first. He thought we should follow our orders and wait for help." "But you couldn't wait," Emma chimed in, having heard the story many times. "That's right. Sometimes you have to do what's right even when it's not what you're told to do. And Jacob, even though he disagreed with me, came along because family stands together. And he saved you from the bad soldier," Ben added. "He did. Jacob died protecting me and those families. That's why we remember him as a hero, even though he made mistakes earlier." Sarah watched her children absorb the story, seeing how Jonas used it to teach them about courage, family loyalty, and the possibility of redemption. These were the lessons that would shape them as they grew, not the sanitized fairy tales of perfect heroes, but the complex truth about real people making difficult choices. After dinner, while Jonas read to the children from a book of fairy tales, Sarah stepped outside to enjoy the evening air. The Montana sky was vast and clear, stars beginning to appear as the sun settled behind the mountain peaks. This valley was everything Jonas's Colorado hideaway had been, isolated, beautiful, peaceful, but it felt completely different because they'd chosen it together as a family. "Beautiful night," Jonas said, joining her on the porch after settling the children in their beds. "Beautiful life," Sarah replied, leaning against his solid warmth. "Any regrets?" Jonas asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Sarah considered the question seriously. Did she regret leaving Colorado, the home Thomas had built, the community where she'd struggled to survive? Did she regret the public scandal of the trial, the whispers and speculation that had followed them even after Jonas's vindication? None, she said finally. Well, except maybe that I waited so long to tell you I loved you. Jonas chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. You told me exactly when you were ready to. I wouldn't change anything about how we found each other. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. Her desperate widowhood, Jonas's self-imposed exile, the children's need for security and love, the false accusations that had nearly torn them apart. Jonas, she said quietly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Marshall Brennan had succeeded, if you'd been convicted? Every day, Jonas admitted. But then I remember that you wouldn't have let that happen. You climbed a mountain to find me when I tried to run. You stood up in a federal courtroom and demanded justice. You fought for us when I'd given up fighting for myself. We fought for us, Sarah corrected. All of us together. Yes, Jonas agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Together, inside the cabin, Sarah could hear the children's sleepy voices as they settled down for the night. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges. Ben would need help with his letters. Emma would want to practice her carving. Mary would require constant watching as she explored her expanding world. Jonas would work on the addition to their cabin that would give the children more space as they grew. Sarah would tend her garden and preserve food for winter and continue the 100 small tasks that kept a frontier family fed and clothed and safe. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young bride full of romantic dreams, but it was better than anything she'd dared hope for during those dark years of widowhood. It was real and honest and built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. Sarah, Jonas said suddenly, there's something I want to tell you. She turned in his arms to face him, noting the serious expression on his weathered features. What is it? When I was living alone in those mountains, I used to tell myself I was protecting myself from loss by avoiding connection. But really, I was already lost. I'd lost myself along with my family, lost any sense of purpose or joy or hope. Sarah waited, sensing he had more to say. You didn't just accept me as I was, Jonas continued. You helped me remember who I could be. You and the children gave me back my life. Jonas, let me finish, he said gently. I know you think you smell like fish sometimes after a long day at the creek, and I want you to know that I still love that smell, because it means you're working hard to provide for our family. It means you're strong and capable and willing to do whatever it takes to protect the people you love. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes as she remembered that first confession by the creek, the shame she'd felt, the miracle of his acceptance. But more than that, Jonas said, I love everything about you. I love your courage and your loyalty and your stubborn refusal to give up on people you care about. I love watching you with the children, seeing how you balance discipline with affection. I love the way you hum while you cook, and the way you read everything you can get your hands on, and the way you make this cabin feel like home just by being in it. I love you too, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I know you do. And that's the miracle I wake up grateful for every single day, that a woman like you could love a man like me. Sarah reached up to frame his face with her hands, feeling the rough texture of his beard, the warmth of his skin. Jonas Fletcher, you are exactly the man I needed, exactly when I needed you. And our children, all 3 of them, are lucky to have you as their father. They kissed then, soft and sweet under the Montana stars, 2 people who'd found their way to each other through loss and hardship, and the kind of love that didn't care about perfect circumstances or social expectations. When they broke apart, Sarah noticed something glinting in Jonas's hand, a small wooden carving she hadn't seen before. What's that? She asked. Jonas smiled, holding up the tiny figure. It was a family, 2 adults and 3 children, carved with exquisite detail despite its small size. Anniversary present. It's been 6 months since we were married. Sarah accepted the carving with trembling hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. Jonas had captured each family member perfectly. Sarah with her practical dress and determined expression, himself with his gentle strength, Emma with her book, Ben with his horse, Mary with her arms outstretched in joy. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "When did you find time to make this?" "During those evenings when you thought I was just whittling scraps," Jonas admitted. "Wanted to surprise you." Sarah turned the carving over in her hands, seeing the love and patience that had gone into every detail. This was what Jonas did. He noticed what mattered to people and found ways to honor it, to make it permanent, to show them they were valued. "I have something for you too," Sarah said, reaching into her apron pocket. She pulled out a letter, worn soft from handling. "I finally heard back from the War Department." Jonas's expression grew serious. "About Jacob, about both of you. They're officially updating the records to show that Jacob Fulton died a hero at Murfreesboro, and that Jonas Fletcher served with distinction throughout the war. Your name is completely cleared, and Jacob's desertion charge has been posthumously dismissed in light of his final actions." Relief flooded Jonas's features. For 6 months, even though he'd been legally vindicated, a part of him had worried that somewhere in some government file, his name was still associated with his cousin's crimes. "There's more," Sarah continued. "They're awarding Jacob a posthumous medal for his actions at Murfreesboro. His sacrifice to save civilians is being officially recognized." Jonas's eyes filled with tears. He'd have liked that. Jacob always wanted to be remembered as more than his mistakes. Now he will be. They stood holding each other as the night deepened around them, two people who'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone worth fighting for, worth growing with, worth building a life alongside. "Mama! Papa!" Emma's voice called from inside the cabin. "Mary's having a nightmare." Sarah and Jonas exchanged a look of amused resignation. Parenthood didn't pause for romantic moments. "Coming, sweetheart," Sarah called back, but before they went inside, she turned to Jonas one more time. "Do you know what I realized today?" "What's that?" "I don't remember the last time I worried about smelling like fish. Not because I've stopped fishing. I still love our morning trips to the creek with the children, but because you taught me that the people who matter don't care about such things." Jonas smiled. "And you taught me that running away from love doesn't protect you from loss. It just guarantees you'll lose what matters most." "Good thing we're both slow learners," Sarah said with a laugh. "It took us a while to figure out what we had, but we got there eventually." Inside the cabin, they found Mary sitting up in her small bed, tears streaming down her cheeks as Emma tried to comfort her. Ben was awake too, his wooden horse clutched protectively against his chest. "What's wrong, little one?" Jonas asked, kneeling beside Mary's bed. "Bad dream," Mary sniffled. "You went away again." Sarah's heart clenched. Despite the months of security and stability, Mary still sometimes feared that the adults in her life might disappear without warning. "I'm not going anywhere," Jonas said gently, lifting Mary into his arms. "Papa's staying right here with you and Mama and Emma and Ben forever and always." "Promise?" "I promise. And when Papa makes a promise, what does he do?" "Keeps it," Mary said, her tears already subsiding. "That's right. Now would you like Papa to tell you a special story to help you sleep?" As Jonas settled into the rocking chair Sarah had inherited from Thomas's mother, all 3 children gathered around him, Emma and Ben sitting on the floor at his feet, Mary curled in his lap, Sarah perched on the arm of the chair, completing their family circle. "Once upon a time," Jonas began, his voice taking on the rhythm of a born storyteller, "there was a woman who was very brave and very strong, but she'd forgotten how special she was." Sarah realized with surprise that he was telling their story, their real story, transformed into the kind of fairy tale that would help the children understand their family's journey. This woman had 3 beautiful children who loved her very much, but she had to work very hard to take care of them all by herself. She spent her days by a magical creek where silver fish swam, and she became the best fisherwoman in the whole kingdom. Like Mama, Ben whispered. Just like Mama, Jonas agreed. Now, up in the mountains, lived a lonely giant who'd forgotten how to be happy. He'd built walls around his heart because he was afraid of being hurt. Jonas continued the story, weaving their real experiences into a tale of magic and wonder. The children listened with rapt attention as he described how the brave fisherwoman and the lonely giant found each other, how they learned to trust and love, how they faced the evil sorcerer who tried to separate them with lies and false accusations. And they all lived happily ever after? Emma asked as the story wound down. They lived, Jonas said, meeting Sarah's eyes over the children's heads, exactly as happily as they chose to live, each and every day. It was, Sarah realized, the perfect ending, not the promise of effortless happiness, but the acknowledgement that joy was a choice, renewed daily through love and commitment, and the decision to keep building something beautiful together. As they tucked the children back into their beds, Sarah felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. This cabin, this valley, this family, it was everything she'd never dared dream of during those dark years of widowhood. Later, as she and Jonas prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror Jonas had surprised her with for her last birthday. The woman looking back was different from the desperate widow who'd first encountered the mountain man by the creek. This woman's face showed laugh lines alongside the worry lines, contentment mixed with the inevitable concerns of a frontier mother. "What are you thinking about?" Jonas asked, noticing her reflection. "Just remembering," Sarah said. "The woman I used to be, the life I thought I'd have to settle for. Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Sarah considered the question one final time. The loss of Thomas, the years of struggle, the fear and uncertainty that had marked her early widowhood, all of it had been necessary to bring her to this moment, this family, this love that was deeper and truer than anything she'd experienced before. "None," she said firmly. "Every hard day, every moment of doubt, every time I thought I couldn't keep going, it all led me to you, to us, to this life we've built together." Jonas wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood looking at their reflection, a matched pair, scarred by experience, but strengthened by love, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. "I love you, Sarah Fletcher," Jonas whispered against her ear. "I love you too," Sarah replied, leaning back against his solid strength. "Fish, smell and all," Jonas laughed. The rich, joyful sound of a man who'd found his way home. Especially the fish smell. Outside their window, the creek where they'd first met ran silver in the moonlight, its constant murmur a reminder of the persistence required for any good thing to grow. And inside their cabin, surrounded by the breathing of sleeping children and the warmth of shared love, Sarah McKenna Fletcher finally understood what true happiness felt like. It smelled like pine smoke and fresh bread and the faint scent of river water that would always cling to her hands. It sounded like children's laughter and Jonas's gentle voice reading bedtime stories. It felt like coming home every single day to people who loved her exactly as she was. And if sometimes she still smelled like fish after a long day at the creek, well, that was perfectly fine with everyone who mattered.